Three men knelt on frozen stone before Duke Kalor Ashbourne, and not one of them could stop shaking. The northern wind carried the smell of burning timber across the courtyard of Blackmere Castle, while 200 soldiers stood in perfect formation, watching their lord decide who would survive the morning. Kalor had not spoken in 4 minutes. 4 minutes of silence that broke grown men faster than any blade. What happened next inside that fortress altered the balance of power across every noble house in the kingdom, and the woman who walked through those gates 3 days later destroyed everything Kalor believed about control. The youngest of the three men broke first. His name was Lord Edrin Caswell, third son of a minor barony east of the Grey March River, and he made the catastrophic mistake of opening his mouth before Kalor Ashbourne gave permission for anyone to breathe. "Your Grace, I swear on my family's honor that the grain shipments were delayed by weather alone. The roads through Herondale became impassable after the storms, and we had no way to—" "Stop." One word. Kalor did not raise his voice. He never needed to. The syllable landed across the courtyard like a hammer strike against an anvil, and every soldier in formation felt their spines lock straighter. Edrin Caswell's jaw clamped shut so hard his teeth cracked against each other. Kalor stood at the top of the stone steps leading down into the execution yard, his black coat falling past his knees, his gloved hands clasped behind his back. He was 34 years old, built like a man who had never stopped training for war even after the wars had ended, and his face carried the kind of stillness that made lesser men confuse patience with mercy. They learned the difference eventually. He descended 3 steps. His boots struck granite with deliberate rhythm. Every pair of eyes in the courtyard tracked his movement the way prey animals track the shadow of something circling overhead. "Lord Caswell." Kalor stopped 6 feet from the kneeling man. "Blackmere feeds 11,000 people through the winter. Your family contracted to deliver 400 tons of grain before the first frost. The frost came 3 weeks ago. The grain did not." "Your Grace, I did not ask you to speak." Edrin's mouth closed again. Sweat ran down his temples despite the freezing air. Beside him, the 2 other kneeling men, a merchant named Torin Brask and his bookkeeper, stared at the ground with the focused intensity of men who understood that eye contact with this particular duke was an act of suicide. Kalor circled behind them, slowly, the way a man inspects livestock before deciding which animals are worth keeping alive. "Torin Brask." The merchant flinched at the sound of his own name. "You brokered the contract between Lord Caswell's family and my duchy. You guaranteed delivery. You accepted payment in advance." Kalor paused directly behind the merchant's shoulder, close enough that his shadow fell across the man's hunched back. "Where's my grain, Torin?" The merchant's voice came out cracked and thin. "Your Grace, The Caswell family diverted the shipment. I discovered it only after—" "You discovered nothing." Kalor walked back around to face all 3 men. "My steward discovered it. My soldiers traced the missing grain to 3 warehouses in Dunhollow, where it was being sold at triple the contracted price to buyers from the southern provinces." He let the information settle across the courtyard like frost. "You did not lose my grain, Torin. You stole it, and Lord Caswell provided the means." Silence. The kind of silence that has weight and temperature. Kalor removed his right glove, slowly, finger by finger. The gesture meant nothing practical. It was theater, and he knew it. Every ruler who maintained power understood that governance was performance as much as policy. The difference between a feared duke and a dead one was the ability to make every witness in the courtyard remember this moment when they lay in their beds tonight, wondering whether their own secrets were safe. They were not. "Lord Caswell, your family's lands east of Greymarch are forfeit to the Duchy of Blackmere, effective immediately. Your father will receive formal notice before sundown. You personally are stripped of all titles and barred from holding noble rank for the remainder of your natural life." Edrin Caswell made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a sob. Something between the two. The sound of a man watching his entire future collapse in a single sentence. "Torin Brask." Kalor pulled his glove back on. "Your trading license is revoked across all northern territories. Your warehouses in Dunhollow are seized. The grain will be distributed to Blackmere's reserves by morning." He looked at the bookkeeper. You will provide my steward with every financial record from the past 2 years. If a single page is missing, you will join Torin in the cells beneath this castle. And I promise you, the cells beneath Blackmere have never been described as comfortable by anyone who survived them. The bookkeeper nodded so rapidly, his neck looked ready to separate from his shoulders. Kaelor turned his back on all three men and climbed the stone steps without looking behind him. That was the final piece of the performance. The absolute certainty that none of these broken men posed enough threat to warrant watching. At the top of the steps, his steward waited. A tall, angular man named Aldrich Voss, who had served the Ashbourne family for 22 years and understood his master's rhythms the way a musician understands tempo. The Crown's courier arrived an hour ago, Your Grace. Kaelor did not slow his stride as he entered the fortress corridor. Torches lined the walls at precise intervals, casting amber light across stone that had been standing since his great-grandfather's era. The air inside Blackmere always carried a particular coldness, not the cold of neglect, but the cold of a place that had been designed to remind every visitor that warmth was a privilege granted, not a right assumed. And Aldrich kept pace beside him, his ledger tucked beneath his arm. The message bears the royal seal. It concerns a matter of domestic arrangement. Kaelor stopped walking. In 22 years of service, Aldrich had never once hesitated over a choice of words. The steward was precise the way surgical instruments were precise, because imprecision in Blackmere's inner circle was a career-ending quality. Say it plainly, Aldrich. The steward's expression remained carefully neutral. The Crown has negotiated a marriage arrangement between yourself and Lady Seraphine Virel of House Virel. For 3 full seconds, Kaelor Ashbourne did not move, did not blink, did not breathe visibly. His body processed information the same way his mind processed threats, by going absolutely still while every internal calculation ran simultaneously. House Virel, he said finally. Not a question. A measurement. The daughter of Lord Castellan Virel. She arrives in 3 days. Kaelor resumed walking. Faster now. His boots struck the corridor floor with a rhythm that Aldrich recognized as controlled anger rather than urgency. The difference was subtle but critical. Urgency meant Kaelor needed more information. Controlled anger meant he already had enough information and did not like what it told him. The Crown does not negotiate marriages for northern dukes unless the Crown wants something from the north that it cannot take by force. Kaelor turned a corner and pushed through a heavy oak door into his private study. Maps covered every wall. Military positions, trade routes, harvest yields, population distributions. The anatomy of a duchy laid bare in ink and parchment. He did not rule Blackmere from a throne. He ruled it from this room, where numbers and geography told truths that courtiers never would. What does the Crown want, Aldrich? The steward closed the door behind them. Stability. The southern provinces are restless. 3 noble houses have formally protested the new taxation edicts. The Crown needs northern loyalty guaranteed through blood alliance, not merely treaty. Blood alliance. Kaelor repeated the phrase as though tasting something rancid. They want a leash, a woman planted inside my household to ensure I remain cooperative. That is one interpretation, Your Grace. It is the only interpretation. He leaned over the largest map on his desk, the full territory of Blackmere and its surrounding provinces. His fingers traced the border between northern and southern lands. House Virel controls the Ashen March Pass, the only viable trade route between the northern highlands and the Crown's capital. If I refuse this marriage, the Crown restricts trade through the pass. Blackmere's economy contracts within 6 months. Within a year, I'm negotiating from weakness. He straightened. If I accept, I have a stranger in my house, reporting my movements to her father, who reports to the Crown. Aldrich said nothing. He had served long enough to understand when Kaelor was thinking out loud and when he wanted counsel. This was the former. Prepare the east wing, the formal chambers, not the guest quarters. Kaelor moved to the window and looked down at the courtyard where Idrin Caswell was still being escorted away by soldiers. If the Crown wants to send me a wife, she will live in Blackmere under Blackmere's rules, not the Crown's. And if the lady proves difficult? Kaelor's reflection stared back at him from the frost-edged glass. The face of a man who had inherited a crumbling duchy at 19, buried his father before the body was cold, executed 3 conspirators before his 20th birthday, and built the most powerful northern territory in a generation through methods that polite society described as ruthless when they were feeling generous. Then she will learn the same lesson everyone learns in this castle, Aldrich. Blackmere does not accommodate. Blackmere consumes. The steward bowed and departed. Kaelor remained at the window, watching the courtyard empty as soldiers returned to their barracks and servants resumed their duties. The machinery of his duchy operated with mechanical precision because he had spent 15 years removing every component that did not function exactly as designed. People, policies, alliances, all interchangeable parts in a system built to serve one purpose: the survival of Blackmere and the absolute authority of its duke. A wife was a variable he had never calculated for. Variables created unpredictability. And unpredictability, in Kaelor's experience, was the thing that killed dukes who believed their power made them untouchable. He would not make that mistake. Whatever Lady Seraphine Virel brought through those gates, he would measure it, contain it, and control it. The same way he controlled everything else within his borders. 3 days later, when the carriage bearing the Virel family crest appeared on the northern road, Kaelor discovered how profoundly wrong a man could be about a woman he had never met. She arrived without an entourage. The carriage carried Lady Seraphine Virel, a single maidservant, and 2 trunks of personal belongings. No armed escort, no political advisors, no family representatives to negotiate terms or establish conditions. Kaelor watched from the upper gallery as the carriage entered the main courtyard, and the first crack in his assessment appeared the moment she stepped onto Blackmere's frozen ground. She did not look up. Every visitor who entered Blackmere Castle looked up. The fortress was designed to provoke exactly that reaction. Towering walls of black stone, iron battlements, gargoyles carved into the cornices with expressions of permanent fury. The architecture was psychological warfare made physical, and it worked on everyone from peasant traders to visiting royalty. Seraphine Virel stepped out of the carriage, adjusted her traveling cloak against the wind, and walked toward the main entrance as though she were arriving at a country inn rather than the most feared stronghold in the northern territories. Kaelor descended from the gallery. He took the long staircase rather than the direct route, using the additional minutes to observe her through successive windows as she crossed the courtyard. She moved with an economy that interested him. No wasted gestures, no theatrical composure. The way someone moved when they had already decided exactly how much energy every situation deserved and refused to spend more than the allocated amount. He met her in the entrance hall, 40 feet of vaulted ceiling, banners of the Ashbourne family hanging from iron rods. A fireplace large enough to stand inside, burning logs thick as a man's torso. And standing before all of it, Kaelor Ashbourne in full ducal authority. Black coat, silver chain of office, and the expression of a man who had never once been surprised by anything that walked through his front door. Lady Virel. She stopped 10 feet from him, close enough for conversation, far enough to establish that she had no intention of closing the distance as a gesture of deference. Duke Ashbourne. Her voice was lower than he expected. Steady the way a river is steady, what? Not because it lacks force, but because its force is constant. He studied her with the same analytical precision he applied to battlefield maps and financial ledgers. 26 years old, according to the Crown's correspondence. Dark hair pulled back from her face in a style that prioritized function over fashion. Eyes the color of iron ore, gray with flecks of something warmer buried underneath. Not beautiful in the way that court poets described beauty. Something harder than that. Something that suggested beauty was an asset she had inventoried and decided not to deploy. You traveled without escort, Kaelor said. It was not a greeting. It was an interrogation tactic. Begin with an observation that reveals how much you already know. I did. The northern roads are dangerous in winter. Bandits operate freely between the Grey March and the Highland Passes. I am aware of the geography. Then you are either reckless or making a deliberate statement about your opinion of my ability to secure my own territory. The faintest shift crossed her expression, not a smile. Something more controlled than that. The kind of micro-expression that only appeared on the faces of people who had learned to manage their reactions in environments where visible emotion was exploited as weakness. Neither, Your Grace. I traveled light because heavy entourages move slowly, and I saw no reason to prolong a journey to a destination I did not choose. Kaelor felt something shift behind his sternum, not admiration. He did not admire easily, and never on first impression, something closer to recognition, the instinct of one predator identifying another's particular hunting pattern. Aldrich will show you to your chambers. Dinner is served at 8 in the Great Hall. Attendance is not optional. I was not planning to hide in my room, Your Grace. That remains to be seen. He turned and walked away. Behind him, he heard Aldrich's footsteps approaching Seraphine with the careful courtesy the steward applied to every new variable entering the Blackmere system. Kaelor did not look back. He never looked back, but for the first time in years he wanted to. That impulse bothered him more than anything she had actually said. Dinner that evening was a performance calibrated to establish dominance. Kaelor had arranged it deliberately. A formal meal in the Great Hall with his 12 senior advisors, military commanders, and household officers flanking the table in order of rank. Seraphine would be seated to his left, the traditional position of a duchess-to-be, which placed her directly in the sightline of every powerful figure in Blackmere's inner circle. He expected her to be overwhelmed. The Great Hall was designed for exactly that purpose. Iron chandeliers holding 300 candles, walls lined with ancestral weapons, and the mounted standards of defeated enemies, and a table long enough to seat 40, crafted from a single oak that had been felled the year Blackmere was founded. The room communicated one message with absolute clarity. This dynasty does not bend. Seraphine arrived precisely at 8. She wore a dark green dress that covered her from collarbone to wrist. No jewelry, no decoration, nothing that invited the eye to linger on anything except her face. She took her seat without waiting for Kaelor to acknowledge her, unfolded her napkin, and turned to the military commander seated across from her with the directness of someone about to conduct business. "Commander Rathmore, is it?" The commander, a scarred veteran of 3 border campaigns, blinked at being addressed before the Duke had formally opened the meal. His eyes flicked to Kaelor for guidance. Kaelor offered none. "Yes, my lady." "How many active garrisons does Blackmere maintain along the Grey March border?" The table went silent. Not quiet, silent. The difference between those two states contained more information about power dynamics than any textbook on governance ever written. 12 of the most powerful people in the Northern Territories stared at this woman who had been inside their castle for less than 6 hours and was already asking questions about military deployment. Rathmore's jaw tightened. "That information is not typically shared at the dinner table, my lady." "Then you will share it at breakfast. I will be riding the eastern perimeter tomorrow morning and would prefer to know how many uniforms I should expect to see." Kaelor set down his wineglass. The crystal rang against the table surface, a small sound that silenced every remaining murmur in the hall. "You will not be riding the eastern perimeter." Seraphine turned to him, slowly, with the deliberate control of someone who had anticipated exactly this response and had already prepared 3 levels of counter-argument. "I understood that the Duchess of Blackmere traditionally inspects the household's operational capacity within the first week of residence, unless that tradition has been discontinued." She was right. The tradition was documented in the Ashbourne family charter, a formal protocol that granted the Duchess authority to survey domestic and logistical operations. Kaelor had not expected her to know that. He had not expected her to know anything about Blackmere's internal customs. The realization that she had prepared for this assignment, studied his duchy the way he would have studied an enemy's fortifications before a siege, landed in his chest like a slow blade between the ribs. "The tradition stands," he said carefully, "but the eastern perimeter is a military zone, not a domestic operation. Trade caravans moving through the Grey March border require domestic coordination between garrison supply chains and merchant guilds. That intersection falls under household authority, not military command." She paused exactly long enough for every advisor at the table to process the fact that she was correcting the Duke of Blackmere in his own great hall. "Unless you have restructured the charter, Your Grace." He had not. The silence that followed was the most dangerous moment of the evening. 12 powerful people watching their duke be outmaneuvered on a point of institutional knowledge by a woman who had not yet unpacked her trunks. Every advisor at that table was calculating. Some were calculating whether Seraphine was an asset or a threat. Some were calculating whether this was the beginning of a power shift within Blackmir's inner circle. And some, the smarter ones, were calculating what Kaelor Ashbourne would do to reassert control. Commander Rathmore, Kaelor did not look away from Seraphine. Provide Lady Virel with a full garrison briefing by morning. She will ride the eastern perimeter with an armed escort of my choosing. Rathmore nodded. Yes, Your Grace. And Lady Virel. Kaelor picked up his wine glass again. His fingers were perfectly steady. The next time you wish to test the boundaries of your authority in my household, I suggest doing so in private. My tolerance for public theater has a very specific threshold, and you have just discovered its edge. Seraphine held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she lifted her own glass and drank. Noted, Your Grace? The meal continued. Conversations resumed with the forced normalcy of people who understood they had just witnessed something significant and were not yet certain what it meant. Kaelor ate without tasting the food. His mind was running calculations that had nothing to do with grain shipments or garrison deployments. This woman was not a leash sent by the crown. She was not a spy, or if she was, espionage was secondary to something far more dangerous. She understood systems. She understood leverage points within institutional structures. And she understood that the fastest way to establish power inside an unfamiliar hierarchy was not to challenge the leader directly, but to demonstrate competence so visibly that the hierarchy reorganized around her without the leader's permission. Kaelor had spent 15 years perfecting that exact strategy. Watching someone deploy it against him was the psychological equivalent of staring into a mirror that reflected back a version of himself he had never anticipated encountering. After dinner, he dismissed his advisors and walked the castle corridors alone. Blackmir at night was a different creature than Blackmir by day. The torches burned lower, the shadows stretched longer, and the ancient stone seemed to contract around its inhabitants like a fist slowly closing. Hyler walked these corridors every night. It was not patrol, it was maintenance. The physical act of moving through every section of his domain, confirming that each passage, each doorway, each shadow contained exactly what it should contain and nothing more. Tonight the routine failed him. His thoughts kept circling back to that dinner table, to the precise way Seraphine had constructed her challenge, not reckless, not aggressive, but architecturally sound, every word placed like a stone in a foundation that she was building towards something he could not yet see. Possession. That was the answer. The only answer that had ever worked within these walls. You did not negotiate with variables. You owned them, controlled the inputs, controlled the outputs, controlled the environment until the variable had no room to operate outside the parameters you defined. He would define her parameters. He would contain her competence within channels that served Blackmir's interests, and he would ensure that whatever agenda she carried from House Virel or the Crown died of suffocation inside the controlled atmosphere of his duchy. The problem was that standing in the frozen corridor at midnight, watching his own breath crystallize in the torchlight, Kaelor Ashbourne could not shake the feeling that Seraphine Virel had already anticipated exactly this response, and had prepared for it. He found Aldrich in the steward's office on the ground floor, reviewing supply ledgers by candlelight. The steward looked up as Kaelor entered. 22 years of service had taught Aldrich to read his master's moods the way navigators read weather patterns, not by what was visible on the surface, but by the atmospheric pressure behind it. Your Grace, you are walking later than usual. Tell me everything we know about House Vyriel, not the Crown's briefing, our own intelligence. Aldrich set down his pen. House Virel controls the Ashenmarch Pass and 3 adjacent provinces. Lord Castellan Virel is politically moderate, publicly loyal to the Crown, and privately ambitious enough to have expanded his territorial influence by 40% over the last decade without triggering a single formal objection from neighboring houses. His daughter was educated at 3 different courts before returning to the family estate 4 years ago. 3 different courts: Westholm, Greyvale, and the Crown's own court at Calenhad. Kaelor processed that information the way a siege commander processes enemy troop movements. 3 courts meant 3 different political educations, 3 different networks of contacts and obligations, 3 different institutional cultures absorbed and analyzed before the age of 22. She was not sent here as a decorative alliance, Kaelor said quietly. No, Your Grace, I do not believe she was. She was sent here as a strategist. House Virel is placing an operative inside Blackmir's hierarchy. He turned toward the door. Double the intelligence reports on House Virel's financial movements. I want to know every contract, every trade agreement, every correspondence that passes through the Ashenmarch Pass for the next 60 days. Your Grace, Aldrich's voice carried a tone that Kaelor recognized as the steward preparing to say something his master would not enjoy hearing. May I observe something? Quickly. Lady Virel did not attempt to conceal her competence tonight. A spy would have presented herself as harmless. A political operative would have spent weeks building trust before revealing capability. Aldrich paused. She showed you exactly what she is on the first evening. That is not the behavior of someone trying to deceive you. That is the behavior of someone who wants you to understand precisely what you are dealing with. Kaelor stood in the doorway for a long moment. The torchlight carved his features into planes of shadow and gold, and somewhere deep inside the architecture of a mind that had been built for control, a single question formed that he did not have an answer for. What kind of woman walks into the most dangerous fortress in the kingdom and dares its master to see her clearly? He left without responding. Aldrich did not expect a response. Some questions were not meant to be answered in the moment they were asked. They were meant to be carried through the dark corridors of Blackmir Castle like a lit fuse, burning slowly towards something that neither man could yet see. Kaelor reached his private chambers and stood before the window overlooking the frozen valley below. The moon hung low over the distant tree line, casting silver light across a landscape that belonged to him. Every acre, every river, every road, every soul that breathed between these mountains and the sea. Control. That was what separated him from every duke who had come before and failed. Not strength, not wealth, not military power. Control over the environment that produced those things. Remove control, and strength became violence without direction. Wealth became a target. Military power became a tool that anyone could seize. Seraphine Virel threatened his control, not through opposition. Opposition he understood. Opposition he could crush the way he had crushed Edrin Caswell this morning without raising his voice. She threatened it through competence, through the particular danger of someone who could operate within his systems without needing his permission or his approval. He pressed his palm flat against the frozen glass and felt the cold burn through his skin. The sensation grounded him the way pain always grounded him, an old habit learned from a childhood that had taught him exactly one reliable truth about the world. Everything you cannot hold will eventually be taken from you. Everything. Somewhere in the East Wing, in chambers prepared by his own order, the woman who had been sent to become his wife was likely conducting her own analysis of tonight's dinner, cataloging every advisor's reaction, mapping every alliance and every tension she had observed, building her own architecture of understanding inside the walls of his castle. He removed his hand from the glass and looked at the print his palm had left, a brief mark of warmth on the frozen surface, already fading. By morning, Aldrich's courier arrived with an intelligence report that changed the trajectory of everything Kaelor had planned. House Virel's finances showed a pattern that should not have existed. Over the past 18 months, significant amounts of capital had been quietly redirected from the Ashenmarch Pass trade revenues into accounts that did not correspond to any known Virel family holdings. The money was moving through intermediary merchants, some of whom had direct connections to 3 of the most powerful noble houses in the southern provinces, the same 3 noble houses that had formally protested the crown's new taxation edicts. Kaelor read the report twice, then a third time. Then he set it down on his desk and stared at the map of the kingdom on his wall, tracing the invisible lines of money and influence that connected the Ashenmarch Pass to the southern provinces, to the crown's court, to the dissident noble houses, and finally, inevitably, back to the woman sleeping in his east wing. The crown had not sent him a wife. The crown had not sent him a spy. The crown had sent him a piece on a board he did not yet fully understand, and the game being played around that piece was larger, older, and far more dangerous than a simple marriage alliance. Kaelor reached for his coat. Whatever Seraphine Virel truly was, strategist, operative, pawn, or something he had no category for. The answers were not in intelligence reports or financial ledgers. The answers were in the woman herself, and he intended to extract every single one of them. He descended toward the east wing as the first gray light of dawn crept through Blackmir's arrow-slit windows, and he did not yet know that what waited for him at the bottom of those stairs would dismantle 15 years of certainty in a single conversation. Kaylor found her already awake. Not merely awake, dressed, composed, and standing at the window of her chambers with a cup of tea in one hand and a folded document in the other, as though she had been expecting him to arrive at exactly this hour. The maidservant who answered his knock had barely opened the door before Seraphine's voice carried across the room with the calm authority of someone who had been conducting business since well before dawn. "Your Grace, I assumed you would come earlier." Kaylor stepped inside without invitation. The East Wing chambers were the finest guest quarters in Blackmir. Tall ceilings, heavy drapery, a fireplace that his servants had kept burning through the night. But Seraphine had already altered the room. The ornamental vases had been moved to a side table. The writing desk had been repositioned beneath the window for better light. Small changes. The kind of adjustments that a person makes when they intend to stay and intend to work, not when they are waiting to be told what their life will look like. He noticed all of it. He cataloged all of it. And the fact that she had reshaped his environment within 12 hours of arrival registered in his nervous system as something far more threatening than any financial report. "Leave us," he said to the maidservant. The girl glanced at Seraphine. Not at him. At Seraphine. The hierarchy had already shifted inside this room, and the maidservant's instinct confirmed it. Seraphine gave a small nod, and the girl departed, closing the door behind her. Kaylor did not sit. Sitting would establish this as a conversation between equals, and he had not yet decided what this was. "You studied at 3 courts before returning to your family's estate." He kept his voice flat, informational, the tone of a man reading charges before sentencing. "Westholm, Greyvale, the Crown's Court at Calenhad. That is not a secret, Your Grace." "No, but the education you received at those courts is worth examining. Westholm specializes in trade law and commercial diplomacy. Greyvale is the kingdom's center for military logistics. And Calenhad—" He paused, watching her face the way a swordsman watches an opponent's shoulder for the first signal of a strike. "Calenhad is where the Crown trains its political operatives." Seraphine set her teacup on the windowsill. The gesture was unhurried, deliberate. A woman who understood that the speed at which you respond to an accusation communicates more than the words you choose. "You have been reading intelligence reports about my family." "I have been reading intelligence reports about the Ashen March Pass. Your family happens to be attached to it." "And what did those reports tell you?" Kaylor reached inside his coat and produced the folded document Aldrich's courier had delivered an hour ago. He held it between 2 fingers, not offering it, not concealing it, letting its presence do the work. 18 months of redirected capital, trade revenues from the Ashen March Pass funneled through intermediary merchants into accounts with no connection to any known Virial holdings. The intermediaries themselves have financial ties to 3 southern noble houses currently in open dispute with the Crown. He watched her expression. Nothing moved. Not a muscle, not a flicker. The composure of someone who had been trained to absorb information under pressure without allowing their body to betray the processing happening underneath. "Your father is either financing a rebellion or being used as a financial conduit by people who are. Either way, you were sent to my household carrying the weight of treason, Lady Viral, and I want to know which version of the truth you are going to offer me." The room held its breath. Morning light crept through the window behind Seraphine, outlining her silhouette against the frost-covered landscape outside. She stood very still. Not the stillness of fear, but the stillness of someone making a calculation about how much truth to release and in what sequence. "May I see the report?" "No." "Then you are asking me to respond to an accusation without seeing the evidence. That is not an interrogation, Your Grace. That is a performance." The word landed precisely where she intended it to land. Performance. The same word Kaylor used internally to describe his own methods of governance. She was reflecting his own framework back at him, and the accuracy of that reflection was more unsettling than anything in Aldrich's intelligence briefing. I am not performing. His voice dropped half a register. The temperature in the room seemed to follow. I am deciding whether the woman the crown placed in my household represents a threat that needs to be contained or eliminated. Contained or eliminated? She repeated the words without inflection. Those are your only two categories for people you do not control? Those are my only two categories for people who arrive carrying secrets that could destabilize my duchy. Seraphine crossed the room. Not toward him, toward the writing desk she had repositioned beneath the window. She opened a leather portfolio and removed a sheaf of documents, each one covered in handwriting that Kaylor recognized as meticulous financial notation. I brought these with me from House Virel. She set them on the desk and stepped back, giving him clear access. They are copies of every redirected transaction your intelligence identified. I compiled them myself over the past 14 months. Kaylor did not move toward the documents. Moving toward them would mean following her lead, accepting her frame, operating inside her sequence. Instead, he stayed exactly where he was and kept his eyes on her face. Why would you bring evidence of your own family's financial misconduct into the household of a duke known for destroying anyone who threatens his territory? Because my family's financial misconduct is not my family's. It is my father's steward's. The words landed like a door slamming open in a room where Kaylor had been searching for exits. Lord Marin, she continued, her voice carrying the particular steadiness of someone who had rehearsed this conversation many times, not to deceive, but because the stakes demanded precision. He has managed House Viral's finances for 11 years. He has personal relationships with merchants across the Ashen March Pass network, and for the last 18 months, he has been diverting trade revenues without my father's knowledge or authorization. Your father controls the largest trade corridor in the Northern Territories, and you expect me to believe he failed to notice capital hemorrhaging from his own accounts for a year and a half. My father is 63 years old, Your Grace. He trusts the people he appointed because the alternative, assuming that loyalty is conditional, is a way of thinking he was never built for. Something shifted in her voice. Not softness. Nothing about Seraphine was soft. An undertone of something that lived deeper than political calculation. The particular weight that comes from watching someone you love become vulnerable through the very qualities you once admired in them. I noticed the discrepancies 9 months ago. I spent 5 months confirming them. I spent 4 months trying to convince my father that his most trusted advisor was stealing from him. He refused to hear it. Kaylor processed the information the way his body processed cold, slowly, from the extremities inward, letting the implications settle into the architecture of his understanding before reacting. Every survival instinct he possessed told him to distrust this narrative. It was too clean, too conveniently structured. A woman arrives at his castle carrying the exact evidence needed to redirect suspicion away from her family and toward a subordinate, and he was supposed to accept that at face value. But there was a countercurrent running beneath his suspicion. Aldrich's observation from the previous night. She showed you exactly what she is. A spy conceals. An operative manipulates. Seraphine had walked into Blackmere and placed her competence on display like a weapon laid on a table, handle facing forward. Now she was laying financial documents on a desk and stepping back. The same gesture, the same message. Here is what I carry. Decide what you are going to do about it. If Lord Marin is diverting your family's capital to fund Southern dissidents, Kaylor said, then your father is being positioned to take the fall when the Crown investigates, which the Crown will do, inevitably, because the Crown always follows the money. Yes, and you believe that by bringing this information to me, the one Northern Duke with enough military and political power to intervene, you can protect your father from the consequences of his own steward's betrayal. I believe that Duke Kaylor Ashbourne does not tolerate financial corruption within his sphere of influence, regardless of who benefits from exposing it. She met his gaze with the directness of someone who understood that the next 30 seconds would determine whether this conversation ended in alliance or in the kind of hostile containment that Blackmere was famous for. I did not come here expecting your sympathy, Your Grace. I came here expecting your self-interest. The silence that followed was not empty. It was loaded the way a crossbow is loaded. Tension held in place by a mechanism that could release in any direction depending on which pressure point gave way first. Kaylor walked to the writing desk. He picked up the first document from Seraphine's portfolio and read it, then the second, then the third. His eyes moved across the financial notation with the practiced speed of a man who had been reading ledgers since before he could ride a horse, and what he found in those pages confirmed two things simultaneously. First, the pattern of diversion was real, systematic, and sophisticated enough to have been designed by someone with deep institutional knowledge of northern trade networks. Second, Seraphine's analysis was flawless. Her annotations identified every intermediary, traced every redirected sum to its destination, and mapped the connections between Lord Marin's network and the southern dissident houses with a precision that most professional intelligence operatives would struggle to match. She had not brought him a plea for help. She had brought him a complete tactical briefing. He set the documents down and turned to face her. The morning light had shifted while he read, filling the room with the cold silver glow of a northern winter dawn, and in that light, standing beside the desk she had claimed as her workspace, Seraphine Viral looked nothing like a bride sent to secure a political alliance. She looked like a field commander waiting for her counterpart to finish reviewing the battle map. "This changes nothing about the structure of this marriage," Kaylor said. "You are still here under the Crown's arrangement. You are still inside my household, operating under my authority." "I understand that." "Do you?" He stepped closer, close enough that the disparity in their physical size became impossible to ignore. He stood half a head taller, broader across the shoulders, carrying the density of a body built through 15 years of military discipline. Most people retreated when Kaylor Ashbourne occupied their space. It was instinctive, the same way smaller animals create distance from larger ones, not out of conscious fear, but out of a biological recognition that proximity to something dangerous demands either submission or extraordinary nerve. Seraphine did not move. "I need to be very clear about something," Kaylor said. His voice was low now, not threatening, something more controlled than threatening. The voice of a man establishing terms that he intended to enforce with absolute precision. Black Mirror is not a partnership. It is not a collaboration. It is a system that I built, that I maintain, and that I control. If your intelligence about Lord Marin is accurate, I will act on it because it serves my interests. Not because you asked, not because your father needs protection, and not because you walked into my castle with a portfolio of evidence and expected me to be impressed by your preparation. I did not expect you to be impressed." She held his gaze from less than 2 feet away, and her breathing did not change. "I expected you to be threatened. Impressed men ask questions. Threatened men make speeches about control." The words struck bone. Kaylor's jaw tightened. The muscles in his neck corded beneath his collar. His body understood the hit before his mind finished processing it, and the physical response, the primal tightening of a man who has just been struck in a place he believed was armored, was visible to both of them. He should have walked out. Every protocol of dominance he had built over 15 years demanded that he exit this room immediately, reassert distance, and process this encounter in the controlled environment of his private study where no one could observe the impact she was having on his composure. That was the disciplined response. The strategic response. The response of a duke who understood that proximity to an adversary who could read him this accurately was a form of exposure that no amount of military power could compensate for. He did not walk out. He stood there, 2 feet from a woman who had just identified the architecture of his defensive behavior with surgical accuracy, and he felt something crack along the foundation of a structure he had spent his entire adult life reinforcing. Not collapse, not weakness. Something more dangerous than either. A fracture line. The kind of damage that does not cause immediate failure, but changes the load-bearing capacity of everything built on top of it. "You will provide all of your intelligence on Lord Marin to my steward by midday," Kaylor said. His voice was steady. His hands were steady. Everything visible was steady. "Aldrich will verify your documentation against our own sources. If the information confirms, I will take action against Marin's network within Black Mirror's jurisdiction. Your father's exposure will be managed as a consequence of that action, not as its purpose." "Agreed." "And you will ride the eastern perimeter this morning as you requested. Commander Rathmore will assign your escort. You will report your observations to Aldrich upon return, and those reports will be reviewed by me personally before any action is taken." "Understood." One more condition. He leaned forward by the smallest fraction of an inch. You will not discuss Lord Marin, the redirected capital, or any element of this conversation with anyone inside this castle other than myself and Aldrich. If I discover that you have shared this information with any advisor, servant, or visiting dignitary, I will treat it as a breach of trust equivalent to treason. And you have seen how I respond to treason. I watched you strip a man of everything he owned yesterday morning without raising your voice. I know exactly how you respond to treason, Your Grace. Then we understand each other. We understand each other's terms. That is not the same thing. He left her chambers without another word. The corridor outside was empty. The servants had cleared the east wing the moment the Duke arrived, an automatic response built into the household staff through years of training. Kaelor walked 50 feet before he stopped, pressed his back against the cold stone wall, closed his eyes. His pulse was elevated, not dramatically. A resting rate of 62 pushed to 78, the kind of physiological shift that most people would never notice, but that Kaelor tracked in himself the way an engineer tracks pressure levels in a system operating near capacity. 78. From a conversation, from a woman who weighed 130 pounds and carried no weapon more dangerous than a portfolio of financial documents and a vocabulary calibrated to bypass every defense he owned. Threatened men make speeches about control. She was wrong. He was not threatened. Threatened implied uncertainty, and Kaelor Ashbourne was never uncertain. He was recalculating, adjusting parameters, integrating new data into a model that had functioned perfectly for 15 years and now required modification to account for a variable that refused to behave like any variable he had previously encountered. That was not the same as being threatened. He pushed off the wall and descended toward the main corridor, where the sounds of Blackmere's morning operations had begun. Boots on stone, orders barked in the training yard, iron latches opening as the kitchens prepared the first meal. His castle, his people, his system. But the fracture line remained, invisible, load-bearing, and already spreading. By noon, 3 things had happened that would have been unthinkable 24 hours earlier. First, Seraphine rode the eastern perimeter with Commander Rathmore and a 6-soldier escort, and she returned with observations about supply chain vulnerabilities that Rathmore himself had failed to identify in 3 years of garrison command. The specific gap, a 12-mile stretch where merchant caravans crossed between 2 garrison zones with no coordinated patrol schedule, was exactly the kind of systemic weakness that an enemy with knowledge of Blackmere's trade operations could exploit for smuggling, intelligence gathering, or the quiet movement of men and materials ahead of an organized military action. Second, Aldrich completed his preliminary verification of Seraphine's financial documents and confirmed that her analysis was not only accurate, but had identified 3 intermediary accounts that Blackmere's own intelligence network had missed entirely. Third, a courier arrived from the Crown bearing a second communication, not addressed to Kaelor, but to Seraphine directly. Kaelor intercepted the message. That was his prerogative as Duke of Blackmere and head of household. Every communication entering his castle passed through his authority, and he exercised that authority without apology or hesitation. The message bore the seal of the Royal Chancellor's office, and its contents were brief enough to memorize after a single reading. Lady Seraphine. Confirm arrival and status. Report household disposition at earliest convenience. Chancellor Aldous Thane. Report household disposition. The Crown was not merely monitoring this marriage alliance. The Crown was actively requesting intelligence about Blackmere's internal operations. Through Seraphine, Kaelor sat at his desk with the intercepted message in one hand and Seraphine's financial portfolio in the other, and for the first time in 15 years of ruling Blackmere with absolute authority, he faced a problem that his standard framework could not resolve. If Seraphine was the Crown's agent, then her intelligence about Lord Marin was a tactical offering, accurate information provided to build trust, establishing credibility before the real intelligence extraction began. In that case, every moment of competence she displayed was a calculated performance designed to make Kaelor lower his defenses. If Seraphine was acting independently, genuinely trying to protect her father through an alliance with Blackmere's power, then the Crown's request for intelligence reports meant that she was being used by both sides simultaneously. The Crown expected her to spy on Kaelor, Her family expected her to secure protection, and she had walked into the intersection of those competing demands with nothing but her own capability as a shield. Either version made her dangerous, but they made her dangerous in completely different ways, and Kaelor could not act on one interpretation without potentially catastrophic consequences if the other turned out to be true. He summoned Aldrich. The Crown's message. Does she know it arrived? The courier delivered it publicly, Your Grace. The household staff would have noted its arrival. Then she knows I intercepted it. She would be foolish not to assume so, and Lady Virel is not foolish. Kaelor placed both documents on the desk, the Crown's message and Seraphine's portfolio, side by side. Evidence of two competing narratives about the same woman. The strategist who had walked into his castle carrying proof of her family's vulnerability. And the Crown's correspondent, tasked with reporting on Blackmere's internal disposition to the Royal Chancellor. What does a man do? Kaelor said quietly, more to the room than to Aldrich, when the most dangerous person in his household is also the only person providing intelligence he cannot obtain elsewhere. Aldrich stood by the door with the particular posture of a steward who understood that this question was not rhetorical, but was also not directed at him. It was directed at the version of Kaelor Ashbourne that had never before encountered a situation where control and intelligence gathering required keeping the threat close rather than eliminating it. He keeps her closer than wisdom advises, Aldrich said, and he watches for the moment when her agenda reveals itself through the choices she makes under pressure. Under pressure, Kaelor picked up the Crown's message. Read it once more, then folded it precisely and placed it inside his coat. Arrange a private dinner tonight, my chambers, 2 settings. No staff after the food is served. Your Grace, she wants to operate inside my system, Aldrich. Then she operates under my observation. Every meal, every briefing, every decision that touches Blackmere's interests. I want her so close to the center of this duchy's operations that if she transmits a single piece of intelligence to the Crown without my knowledge, I will know it before the ink dries. Aldrich bowed and departed. Kaelor remained at his desk, staring at the 2 documents that represented the fork in every path forward. The old method was simple. Container, restrict access. Control information flow. Reduce the variable to a manageable input that could not influence outcomes beyond defined parameters. But the old method assumed that the variable was passive. Seraphine Virel was not passive. She was kinetic, a system in motion, generating her own intelligence, building her own networks, identifying vulnerabilities faster than his own trained operatives. Containing her would neutralize the threat, but it would also neutralize the asset. And Kaelor had not survived 15 years at the head of a northern duchy by destroying resources that could be turned to his advantage. The new method was more dangerous. Keep her close. Grant access. Allow her competence to operate within Blackmere's structure while monitoring every output for signs of divided loyalty. Use her capability while guarding against her agenda. The strategy of a man who understood that the most effective form of control was not restriction, but proximity. Keeping the threat so close that you could feel its heartbeat against your own chest and know the exact moment it changed rhythm. The risk was obvious. Proximity worked both ways. The closer he kept Seraphine, the more she would learn about Blackmere's true operations. And the more she learned, the more valuable she became. To the Crown, to her family, and to any faction that understood the strategic worth of a woman embedded inside Duke Kaelor Ashbourne's inner circle. But there was another risk. One that Kaelor identified with clinical precision and immediately classified as the most dangerous variable in the entire equation. The closer he kept her, the harder it became to maintain the emotional detachment that his system required to function. An emotional detachment was not merely a strategic advantage for Kaelor Ashbourne. It was structural, load-bearing, the foundation on which every wall, every protocol, every mechanism of control had been constructed since the day he buried his father and swore that nothing and no one would ever compromise his authority again. Seraphine Virel was already inside the walls, already identifying the load-bearing structures, already applying pressure to the exact points where the architecture was most vulnerable. That evening, when she entered his private chambers for dinner and found the Crown's intercepted message placed deliberately beside her plate, unsealed, unaltered, waiting for her reaction, the game between them shifted from strategic maneuvering to something neither of them could afford to name. because naming it would mean acknowledging that control was no longer the only force operating inside Blackmere Castle. And for a man who had built his entire world on the certainty that control was the only force that mattered, that acknowledgement was not a concession, it was an act of demolition. Seraphine picked up the message. Read it, set it down, and looked at Kaelor with an expression that contained no fear, no surprise, and no apology. Ask me, she said. And Kaelor Ashbourne, the most feared duke in the Northern Territories, the man who had never once in 15 years allowed another human being to dictate the terms of a conversation inside his own walls, heard himself respond with 2 words that broke every rule he had ever built. Tell me. She told him everything. Not in fragments, not in the careful measured portions that a political operative would release to maintain leverage. Seraphine sat across from Kaelor at his private dining table, with the intercepted crown message between them, and dismantled 14 months of accumulated intelligence in a single unbroken narrative that lasted 47 minutes. Lord Marin had not merely been diverting trade revenues. He had been constructing an entirely separate financial infrastructure beneath the surface of House Viral's legitimate operations, a shadow network of merchant accounts, intermediary brokers, and currency exchanges that connected the Ashen March Pass to 4 southern noble houses, 2 foreign trading companies, and a consortium of military suppliers, whose client list included every family currently opposing the Crown's taxation edicts. The scale was not embezzlement. The scale was economic architecture for insurrection. Kaelor listened without interrupting. His food went untouched. His wine went untouched. His hands remained flat on the table, a posture that looked relaxed to anyone who did not understand that Kaelor Ashbourne kept his hands visible and motionless when his mind was operating at maximum velocity, because the body's stillness created a container for the chaos of calculation happening inside. When she finished, the candles on the table had burned down by 2 inches. The silence in the room had the quality of air pressure before a storm, dense, charged, waiting for the first crack of lightning to release what had been building. The Crown's message, Kaelor said finally. Chancellor Thane asking you to report on my household disposition. How many of these reports have you sent? None. You arrived yesterday. The message arrived today. The timing suggests an established communication protocol. The timing suggests the Chancellor is impatient. He expected a report within hours of my arrival. The fact that he sent a follow-up courier means he did not receive one. Seraphine pushed her untouched plate to one side. I have not reported to Chancellor Thane because I have nothing to report that serves my father's interests. The Crown wants intelligence on Blackmere. My father needs protection from Lord Marin. Those 2 objectives are mutually exclusive. I chose my father. You chose your father over the Crown. I chose the option that kept the most people I care about alive. Kaelor studied her across the table. Candlelight moved across her features in shifting planes of gold and shadow, and in that unsteady light, he could see what the controlled composure of daylight had concealed, the faint darkness beneath her eyes, the tension held in the muscles along her jaw, the almost imperceptible tremor at the base of her throat where her pulse was visible against pale skin. She was exhausted, not the fatigue of travel or missed sleep, but the deep structural exhaustion of someone who had been carrying an unsustainable weight for months with no one to share the load and no certainty that sharing it would not destroy her. He recognized that exhaustion. He had built his entire duchy on top of it. I will deal with Lord Marin, Kaelor said. My people will begin dismantling his network within Blackmere's jurisdiction immediately. The southern connections will require more time and more delicacy, but the financial infrastructure he has built cannot function without the Ashen March Pass revenues. Cut the source, and the network starves. And the Crown? The Crown will receive the intelligence it wants, but it will receive it from me, on my terms, through my channels, not through you. He picked up the intercepted message, folded it once, and placed it inside his coat. As far as Chancellor Thane is concerned, you are a loyal wife performing domestic duties inside Blackmere Castle. You are not an intelligence asset. You are not a political operative. You are the Duchess of Blackmere, and every communication between this household and the Crown passes through the Duke. Something shifted in her expression, not gratitude. Seraphine did not seem built for gratitude in its conventional form. something closer to recognition. The same instinct Kaylor had felt the first time she spoke to him in the entrance hall. One predator identifying another's hunting pattern and finding it compatible. "Thank you," she said. The words came out stripped of ceremony, raw. The way a soldier thanks the person who pulled them out of a collapsing trench, not with formality, but with the blunt acknowledgement that survival is not something you express prettily. "Do not thank me," Kaylor stood. "I am not doing this for you. I am doing this because Lord Marin's network threatens Blackmere's economic stability, and the Crown's intelligence requests threaten my autonomy. You happen to be positioned at the intersection of both threats. That makes you useful. Do not confuse useful with valued." He left the room, and for the second time in 2 days, he walked the corridors of Blackmere Castle at night, knowing that the woman in his east wing had seen through the distinction he had just drawn with the precision of a surgeon identifying the exact point where a patient's armor fails to cover the wound underneath. Do not confuse useful with valued. He had said it to establish distance. She had heard it as confirmation that the distance was already collapsing. Over the next 3 weeks, Kaylor dismantled Lord Marin's financial network with the methodical efficiency of a man pulling a building apart from its foundation upward. Aldrich coordinated the intelligence verification, while Commander Rathmore positioned garrison units along the Ashen March Pass trade routes, intercepting merchant convoys carrying diverted capital and redirecting seized funds into Blackmere's treasury. Every operation was executed quietly. No public announcements, no formal charges, no dramatic confrontations that would alert Marin's southern contacts before the full network could be mapped and neutralized. Seraphine worked alongside Aldrich during this period with a competence that the steward described privately to Kaylor as extraordinary. Her knowledge of the Ashen March Pass trade infrastructure filled gaps in Blackmere's intelligence that would have taken months to close through conventional espionage. She identified 3 additional intermediary accounts that even her own original analysis had missed, and she provided Aldrich with a detailed profile of Lord Marin's operational patterns, his communication schedules, his preferred couriers, the specific merchants he trusted with the most sensitive transactions. Kaylor observed all of this from calculated distance. He reviewed every report she produced. He approved every tactical recommendation she offered through Aldrich. He maintained the private dinners, every evening, his chambers, 2 settings, no staff after the food was served. And during those meals, he asked questions designed to map the boundaries of her knowledge, her loyalties, and her intentions with the systematic thoroughness of a cartographer charting unknown territory. What he discovered was more dangerous than anything in Lord Marin's financial ledgers. He discovered that Seraphine Virel was not operating with an agenda. She was operating with principles. She had identified a threat to her family, calculated the most effective response available to her, and executed that response with a discipline that Kaylor recognized because it mirrored his own. The difference, the critical structural difference, was that her discipline served people rather than systems. She had not traveled to Blackmere to acquire power or position. She had traveled to Blackmere because Blackmere's Duke was the only instrument in the kingdom capable of protecting her father from the consequences of a betrayal he refused to see. That realization unsettled Kaylor more deeply than any military threat or political conspiracy. He understood enemies. He understood allies of convenience. He understood the transactional relationships that comprised every human interaction within the world he had built. What he did not understand, what 15 years of ruling through control and containment had never equipped him to process, was someone who operated from loyalty to a person rather than loyalty to an outcome. The concept was foreign to him the way a language is foreign. Not incomprehensible, but requiring a kind of cognitive translation that slowed every interaction by a fraction of a second, creating gaps in his normally seamless analytical processing. Seraphine occupied those gaps. Every day she moved further into the operational structure of his duchy. The household staff responded to her with an efficiency that Kaylor noticed and could not quite explain. Not fear, which was the motivating force he had cultivated, but something adjacent to respect. She remembered names. She asked about families. She spent 40 minutes with the head cook discussing supply chain logistics for the winter provisions and identified a sourcing inefficiency that saved Blackmere 11% on grain procurement costs. 11%. Through a conversation with a cook. Kaylor stood at the window of his study on the 22nd night and watched the torches burning along the castle walls below. His duchy was stronger than it had been a month ago. Marin's network was nearly dismantled. The Ashen March Pass trade routes were secure. The intelligence on southern dissident houses was being compiled into a strategic briefing that would give Blackmere leverage over the Crown's political positioning for years to come. By every measurable standard, the system was performing at peak capacity. And the system's architect was losing sleep, not because of threats, not because of operational concerns, because every evening across the dinner table, he sat with a woman who challenged his assumptions without attacking his authority, who identified his defensive patterns without exploiting them, and who looked at him, looked through him, with the steady gaze of someone who had already cataloged every scar beneath his armor and decided that the man underneath was worth the risk of proximity. He did not know what to do with that. Control did not apply. Containment did not apply. The frameworks that had governed every relationship he had maintained since the age of 19 could not accommodate someone who neither feared him, envied him, nor wanted anything from him that could be traded, leveraged, or withdrawn. She wanted him to see her clearly. She had said as much without saying it, and the act of being seen clearly, fully, without the protective architecture of rank and reputation, was the one vulnerability that Kaylor Ashbourne had never permitted himself to have. On the morning of the 23rd day, everything shattered. Aldrich arrived at Kaylor's study before dawn. The steward's face carried an expression that Kaylor had seen exactly twice in 22 years of service, the expression of a man delivering information that would fundamentally alter the landscape of everything his master had built. "Your Grace, we have a problem." "Define the scope." "Total." Aldrich closed the door behind him and placed a leather dossier on the desk. Commander Rathmore's garrison units intercepted a courier last night carrying documents from Lord Marin's network. The documents were not financial. They were operational. Kaylor opened the dossier. Inside were 7 pages of detailed military planning, troop movements, supply depot locations, fortification assessments, and garrison strength reports. Not for southern dissident forces. For Blackmere itself. Someone inside Blackmere Castle had been providing Lord Marin with comprehensive intelligence about the duchy's military capabilities. The information was precise. Patrol schedules for every garrison along the northern border, rotation patterns for the castle guard, weapons inventory for the main armory, the location and access codes for Blackmere's emergency supply caches, information that was known to fewer than 5 people in the entire duchy. Kaylor read the documents twice. His hands did not shake. His expression did not change. But something behind his eyes went dark, the way a furnace goes dark when the oxygen is cut, not because the fire has died, but because the fire is being compressed into something hotter and more concentrated than open flame. 5 people know about the emergency caches, Kaylor said. His voice was quiet, the dangerous kind of quiet. You, me, Commander Rathmore, Captain Aldrin of the Castle Guard, and Seraphine. Your Grace, Seraphine has had access to the household operational briefings for 3 weeks. The garrison reports, the supply chain documentation, the security protocols, all of it passed through her hands during the Marin intelligence collaboration. Your Grace, the timeline. The timeline is exactly what concerns me, Aldrich. Kaylor stood. The movement was slow, controlled, the deliberate uncoiling of a man whose body had shifted into the physiological state that preceded violence, not the explosive violence of battlefield combat, but the surgical violence of a ruler who has identified a threat inside his own walls and must excise it before it reaches his vital organs. She arrived carrying intelligence about Lord Marin, intelligence that was accurate, intelligence that built trust, intelligence that I used to justify granting her access to Blackmere's operational core. He paused, and the pause contained more fury than any raised voice could have communicated. What if the intelligence was real, but the purpose was not what she claimed? What if protecting her father was never the objective? You believe she was placed here specifically to gain access to our military intelligence. I believe that the Crown's Chancellor asked her to report on Blackmere's household disposition. I intercepted that message. But what if there were messages before that one? Communications established before she arrived. A protocol that did not depend on couriers I could intercept, because it was already in place before she walked through my gates. Aldrich stood very still. Your Grace, I have worked alongside Lady Viral for 22 days. Her work has been extraordinary. I know. That is precisely the problem. Kaelor walked to the map on his wall, the map of Blackmere and its territories. Every border, every garrison, every strategic position, laid bare in ink and parchment. The same information that now existed in Lord Marin's operational dossier. Extraordinary competence is the most effective form of infiltration. You do not need to deceive people if you can make yourself indispensable to them. They grant access willingly because the value of what you provide outweighs the risk of what you might take. He pressed his fist against the map, against the center of Blackmere's territory, against the point that represented his castle, his seat of power, the heart of everything he had spent 15 years building and defending and controlling, with an absolutism that left no room for the kind of trust that could be exploited. Bring her to me. Aldrich hesitated. 1 second, the longest hesitation of his career. Now, Aldrich. The steward departed. Kaelor remained at the map with his fist against the wall and felt the stone cold through his knuckles. 23 days. That was how long it had taken. 23 days for him to violate his own most fundamental principle, the principle that had kept him alive, kept his duchy intact, kept his authority unbreachable since the day he buried his father, and swore that nothing would ever compromise his control again. He had let someone in, not through the gates, through the architecture, into the load-bearing structure of his decision-making, into the spaces between analysis and action where trust operates as the invisible mortar holding everything together. And now the mortar was contaminated, and he could not determine whether the contamination was poison or something else entirely, and the inability to determine that distinction was destroying him more efficiently than any confirmed betrayal could have. Seraphine entered the study 12 minutes later. She took one look at Kaelor's posture, his back to the door, his fist against the map, his coat pulled tight across shoulders that carried tension like loaded springs, and she stopped in the doorway. "Close the door," he said without turning around. She closed it. The sound of the latch engaging was a small, precise click that somehow contained the weight of everything that was about to happen. "Your Grace?" Military intelligence. He turned to face her. Whatever she saw in his expression made her breathing change, the first time he had ever observed a visible physiological stress response from her. Patrol schedules, garrison rotations, weapons inventories, emergency cache locations, detailed and accurate enough to plan a military operation against this castle. He picked up the dossier from his desk and held it in front of her. Found in Lord Marin's courier network, last night, 3 weeks after you arrived and gained access to every operational document in Blackmere's filing system. Seraphine's face went white. Not the white of guilt. He had seen guilty men lose color, and it presented as a splotchy, uneven drain that started at the cheeks and spread downward. This was different. This was the uniform pallor of shock. The body redirecting blood from the skin to the vital organs in response to a threat that the conscious mind had not yet fully processed. "Let me see the documents." "You saw them 3 weeks ago, when you compiled operational reports for Aldrich." Kaelor. It was the first time she had used his name without his title. The informality landed between them like a weapon dropped on stone. "Let me see the documents." He handed her the dossier. She opened it and read with the speed and focus of someone whose survival depended on processing information faster than the threat closing around her. Her eyes moved across each page, and Kaelor watched her pupils track the content, the patrol schedules, the garrison data, the cache locations, with an intensity that communicated either genuine analytical urgency or the most convincing performance of surprise he had ever witnessed. "This information is accurate," she said. Her voice was steady but thin, like a wire pulled to its tensile limit. "But it is not current. These patrol schedules are from 6 weeks ago. The garrison rotations listed here were updated 11 days before I arrived. And the cache locations..." She looked up at him. "These are the locations from the previous quarter. The emergency caches were relocated after the Caswell incident. You moved them as a precautionary measure." Kaelor's jaw tightened. She was correct. The cache locations in the dossier were outdated. He had ordered them relocated the same morning he stripped Edrin Caswell of his titles, as standard security protocol following any internal disciplinary action. The relocation was documented only in records that Seraphine had never accessed because those records predated her arrival. If I were providing intelligence to Lord Marin, Seraphine continued, the information would be current. I had access to current operational data. These documents reflect data that was available to anyone inside Blackmir's command structure 6 weeks ago, before I arrived. The logic was sound. The timeline was sound. The distinction between outdated and current intelligence was exactly the kind of detail that a fabricated defense could not produce under pressure because it required genuine knowledge of Blackmir's security update protocols. But Kaylor's mind was not operating on logic alone. It was operating on the accumulated trauma of 15 years spent learning that trust was the weapon other people used against you. Every betrayal he had survived, and he had survived several, had begun with information that looked sound, logic that appeared airtight, and a person who presented their innocence with exactly the right combination of shock and analytical precision. Who else had access to this data 6 weeks ago? Everyone in your command structure, Rathmore, Aldrin, Aldrich, every senior officer with clearance for operational briefings. She set the dossier on the desk. And anyone those officers shared information with, formally or informally. You are describing a security breach that predates your arrival. I am describing a security breach that someone wants you to attribute to me. The sentence hit him like a blade finding the gap between armor plates, not because of its content, because of its implication. If Seraphine was right, then the leaked intelligence was not merely a breach. It was a weapon, deployed with precise timing 3 weeks after her arrival, after she had gained access to Blackmir's operational structure, to make Kaylor believe that the woman he had allowed into his inner circle was the source. Someone wanted him to turn against her. Someone who understood that the fastest way to neutralize the alliance forming between Blackmir and House Viral was not to attack from outside, but to inject suspicion into the exact point where trust had begun to take root, and that someone had to be close enough to know that trust was forming, close enough to observe the private dinners, the collaborative intelligence work, the slow and dangerous narrowing of distance between a duke who controlled everything and a woman who was teaching him that control was not the same thing as strength. Kaylor looked at the dossier, then at Seraphine, then at the door through which Aldrich had departed 12 minutes ago. 22 years of service. The longest-serving member of Blackmir's inner circle. The man who knew every operational detail, every security protocol, every scheduled relocation of emergency supplies. The man who had watched Kaylor grant Seraphine access to the Duchy's core operations and had described her competence as extraordinary with the measured tone of someone cataloging evidence. The man who had suggested, on the very first night, that keeping the threat close was the strategic response. No. The thought struck Kaylor with the force of a physical blow, and his body processed the impact before his mind could construct a rational framework around it. His vision narrowed. His pulse dropped. Not elevated, dropped, the way heart rate drops when the body shifts from alarm to something older and more fundamental. The predatory stillness of an animal that has just realized the danger is not in front of it, but behind it, and has been behind it the entire time. "Stay here," he said to Seraphine. The words came out flat, stripped of everything: authority, anger, the controlled menace that characterized every command he had issued for 15 years. What remained was raw signal. The voice of a man whose operating system had just crashed and rebooted into something more primitive than strategy. "Kaylor, wait!" He was already through the door. He found Aldrich's office empty. The steward's desk was organized with the mechanical precision that Kaylor had always admired. Ledgers stacked by date, correspondence filed by sender, a brass inkwell positioned at the exact center of the workspace. 22 years of meticulous service reflected in every surface. The bottom drawer of the desk was locked. Kaylor had never seen it locked before. In 22 years, he had never had reason to look. He broke the lock with a letter opener. Inside the drawer was a leather folio containing correspondence that bore no official seal, no sender identification, and no filing record in Aldrich's meticulous system. 18 letters, spanning 14 months, written in a cipher that Kaylor did not recognize but whose structure, alphanumeric substitution with rotating keys, was consistent with Crown Intelligence methodology. 14 months, the same timeline as Lord Marin's financial diversions, the same period during which Seraphine had been independently tracking her father's steward's betrayal. Aldrich Voss had not been observing the threat. Aldrich Voss had been coordinating it. Kaylor stood in the empty office, holding 18 letters that represented the demolition of 22 years of institutional trust, and his body did something it had not done since he was 19 years old, standing over his father's freshly covered grave. His hands shook, not visibly. The tremor was internal, a seismic vibration running through the muscular structure of his forearms and into his wrists. The body's acknowledgement of damage so fundamental that the nervous system could not process it without physical manifestation. He had built Blackmere on Aldrich's foundation. Every system, every protocol, every mechanism of control that had made his duchy the most powerful territory in the northern provinces had been constructed with Aldrich Voss as the load-bearing pillar. The steward did not merely manage operations, he was operations. The central node through which every piece of information flowed, every decision was implemented, every order was translated into action. And that central node had been compromised for 14 months, which meant every decision Kaylor had made during that period, every strategic calculation, every intelligence assessment, every move and countermove in the complex game of northern politics had been made with information that Aldrich had filtered, shaped, and potentially manipulated before it ever reached the Duke's desk. The architecture of certainty that Kaylor had spent 15 years constructing did not crack. It did not fracture. It underwent a phase transition, the instantaneous transformation of a solid structure into something that maintained the same shape but had fundamentally changed its material properties. From the outside, nothing looked different. From the inside, every load-bearing wall had become glass. He heard boots on stone. Approaching from the main corridor, 2 sets, one heavy, one lighter. Aldrich returning with someone, or someone coming for Aldrich. Kaylor slid the cipher correspondence inside his coat, closed the broken drawer, and positioned himself behind the steward's desk with his back to the wall. When Aldrich entered the office 30 seconds later, he found his master sitting in his chair, behind his desk, with an expression that the steward had never seen in 22 years of service. Because in 22 years, Kaylor Ashbourne had never looked at Aldrich Voss the way a man looks at the ground beneath his feet the moment he realizes it has been hollow the entire time. "Your Grace," Aldrich stopped in the doorway. "Lady Varel is waiting in your study. I came to report." "Close the door, Aldrich." The steward closed the door. And in the silence that followed, standing in an office that contained the evidence of his own betrayal in a drawer with a freshly broken lock, Aldrich Voss understood that the most dangerous man in the Northern Territories had just discovered the one truth that would force him to become something far more dangerous than he had ever been before. "Sit down," Kaylor said quietly. "We have a great deal to discuss." Aldrich did not sit. He stood 3 feet from the door he had just closed, and Kaylor watched the steward's eyes perform a calculation that took less than 2 seconds but contained the entire trajectory of what was about to happen. The eyes moved to the desk, to the bottom drawer, to the broken lock that Kaylor had not attempted to conceal, then back to Kaylor's face, where they found something that 22 years of service had never prepared Aldrich Voss to encounter: the absence of anger. Kaylor was not angry. He had passed through anger somewhere between the 7th and 9th letter in that cipher correspondence, the way a blade passes through flesh, quickly, completely, leaving the wound behind without stopping to examine it. What occupied the space where anger should have been was something colder and more functional. The state of a man who has accepted that the foundation beneath him is gone and is now operating entirely on the structural integrity of his own skeleton. "How long did you think you had?" Kaylor's voice was conversational, almost pleasant, the most dangerous register he possessed. "Before I found it. Before some detail failed to align with the version of reality you had been constructing for me." "How long, Aldrich?" The steward's breathing changed. A shallow shift, upper chest expanding instead of the diaphragm. The respiratory pattern of a man whose body had begun preparing for a physical confrontation that his mind was still trying to prevent. "Your Grace, the situation is more complex than those letters suggest." The situation is exactly as complex as 18 cipher-encoded communications with Crown intelligence operatives spanning 14 months suggest. It is precisely that complex. No more, no less. Kaylor leaned back in Aldrich's chair. The leather creaked. Sit down. I will not ask again. Aldrich sat. The chair opposite his own desk. The guest position. The supplicant's position. The geometry of their arrangement, master in the steward's seat, steward in the visitor's chair, communicated the power transfer more effectively than any formal accusation could have. You coordinated with Lord Marin. I facilitated communication channels. I did not coordinate military action. You provided Blackmir's operational intelligence to a network actively preparing for armed conflict against this duchy. I provided outdated intelligence, deliberately. Every piece of information that passed through my channels was 6 to 8 weeks behind current operational status. Enough to demonstrate cooperation, not enough to enable an actual assault. Kaylor processed that claim against the evidence Seraphine had identified. The outdated patrol schedules, the previous quarter's cache locations, the garrison rotations that had been updated before her arrival. The timeline supported Aldrich's assertion. The leaked intelligence was consistently behind the current reality, creating an illusion of access without providing genuine tactical advantage. But the calculation behind that approach was what made Kaylor's blood run at a temperature that felt closer to antifreeze than plasma. Aldrich had not simply betrayed him. Aldrich had managed the betrayal, calibrated it, controlled its output, maintained its appearance of value to the recipients while limiting its actual damage to Blackmir. The steward had applied the same meticulous operational discipline to his treachery that he had applied to 22 years of loyal service. Why? One word. Not a question mark at the end, but a period. A demand. Aldrich's hands were on his knees. Kaylor noted the position. Open palms, fingers spread. The body language of a man presenting himself as unarmed. Whether that was genuine vulnerability or performance, Kaylor could no longer determine. The instrument he had used to measure truth for 2 decades had just revealed itself as compromised, and every reading it had ever produced was now suspect. Because the Crown gave me no choice. Aldrich's voice carried the particular flatness of someone who had rehearsed this explanation many times in the privacy of his own mind, waiting for the day it would be needed. 14 months ago, Chancellor Thane's office contacted me through a back channel. They had evidence of financial irregularities in Blackmir's trade accounts, minor discrepancies that I had overlooked in the quarterly audits. Not criminal, administrative, but framed correctly, they could be presented as evidence of mismanagement or embezzlement. They blackmailed you. They leveraged me. The distinction matters, Your Grace, because blackmail implies a single transaction. What the Crown established was an ongoing intelligence relationship. Regular reports on Blackmir's operational capacity in exchange for the continued suppression of audit irregularities that, if made public, would have undermined your authority at a time when the southern provinces were already testing your borders. You're telling me that you betrayed me to protect me. I am telling you that I made an impossible choice with imperfect information and inadequate options. Aldrich met Kaylor's eyes for the first time since sitting down. The same kind of choice you have made dozens of times from that desk. The same kind of calculation that built this duchy. The only difference is that I made it without your knowledge, because telling you would have forced a confrontation with the Crown that Blackmir was not positioned to survive 14 months ago. The logic was sound. Kaylor hated it for being sound. He hated the clean architecture of the justification, the way each element locked into the next with the precision of a well-constructed argument, because the soundness of the logic made it nearly impossible to separate legitimate strategic reasoning from the sophisticated self-preservation of a man who had been caught and was now deploying every analytical tool at his disposal to survive the next hour. And Lady Varel, Kaylor's voice went quiet, dangerously quiet. The leaked military intelligence timed to make me suspect her. That was your work. That was my insurance. No hesitation, no flinch. When I realized that her presence was disrupting the controlled information environment I had maintained, I needed a contingency. If you discovered the Crown's intelligence operation, suspicion had to fall on the newest variable in the system, not on the longest-serving member of your inner circle. Kaylor stood. The motion was slow enough that it did not trigger a defensive response from Aldrich, But something in the quality of the movement, the deliberate engagement of every muscle group, the compression of weight onto the balls of his feet, communicated that the man rising from behind this desk was operating in a physiological state that had moved beyond conversation. You used her. You manufactured evidence to turn me against the one person in this castle who was providing genuine intelligence about a real threat to my duchy. You exploited my willingness to trust her, a willingness that you yourself cultivated by recommending that I keep her close, to create a scapegoat for your own compromised loyalty. Your Grace, so 22 years, Aldrich. The words came out like stones being laid into a wall, each one placed with weight and finality. You stood beside me when I buried my father. You helped me execute 3 conspirators before I was 20. You built the administrative infrastructure that made Blackmere functional. And for 14 of those months, you were feeding intelligence about my household to the same crown apparatus that is currently trying to reduce my autonomy through a forced marriage alliance. He walked around the desk, slowly. The way he had walked around those 3 kneeling men in the courtyard 25 days ago, circling, assessing, letting the geometry of predator and prey establish itself through physical positioning before a single consequence was announced. You will be confined to quarters under guard. Your access to all operational systems is terminated immediately. Your correspondence will be seized and decoded by my intelligence officers. And Aldrich, he stopped directly in front of the seated man and looked down at him with an expression that contained nothing. No rage, no grief, no satisfaction. A void where 22 years of trust had been. If any element of what you have told me proves false, the consequence will not be political. It will be personal, and it will be permanent. He summoned 2 guards from the corridor. They escorted Aldrich Voss from his own office with the efficient professionalism of men who did not ask questions about orders that came from their duke's mouth in that particular tone of voice. Kaelor stood alone in the empty office and breathed. Once, twice, 3 times, each breath deliberate, each exhalation carrying a fraction of the structural damage out of his chest and into the cold air of a castle that suddenly felt less like a fortress and more like a building whose blueprint had just been revealed to contain rooms he never knew existed. He retrieved the cipher correspondence from his coat and spread all 18 letters across Aldrich's desk. The broken lock on the bottom drawer glinted in the candlelight like a small metallic wound. He would have his intelligence officers decode every letter, map every contact, trace every communication chain back to its origin point in the Crown's apparatus. But the decoding would take time, and time was a resource that had just become critically scarce. Because if Aldrich had been coordinating with the Crown for 14 months, then the Crown knew things about Blackmere that Kaelor had never intended anyone outside his walls to know. And if the Crown knew those things, then the marriage alliance with House Virel was not merely a political leash. It was one component of a larger operation designed to integrate Blackmere into the Crown's intelligence infrastructure permanently, which meant the Crown's next move was already in motion. And Kaelor no longer had a steward to intercept it. He found Seraphine where he had left her, in his study, standing at the map wall, her fingers tracing the trade routes through the Ashen March Pass with the focused attention of someone who was not idly waiting but actively working through a problem. She turned when he entered, and whatever she saw in his face made her stop mid-motion. "It was Aldrich," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "How deep?" 14 months. Crown intelligence, cipher correspondence. He was managing the information I received to maintain his position while feeding operational data to Chancellor Thane's network. Kaelor closed the door, locked it, tested the lock. An act of security that was also an act of containment, sealing the 2 of them inside a room where the conversation about to happen could not leak into the corridors of a castle whose information security had just been proven catastrophically compromised. "He framed you. The military intelligence leak was manufactured to make me believe you were the source." Seraphine absorbed the information without visible reaction. But Kaelor had learned to read her over 3 weeks of private dinners and collaborative intelligence work, and what he saw beneath the composed surface was not shock. It was the particular stillness of someone who had suspected something close to this truth, but had lacked the final piece of evidence to confirm it. "The Crown is not going to stop," she said. Aldrich was their primary asset inside Blackmere. His exposure means they have lost their intelligence pipeline. They will escalate. "I know." How quickly? Kaelor moved to the window. The valley below Blackmere Castle was dark except for the torch lines along the walls and the distant flicker of garrison fires along the northern perimeter. His duchy. His territory. 25 days ago, he had looked at this landscape and felt the absolute certainty of a man who owned everything within his sight. Now he looked at the same landscape and calculated how many of those torchlit positions might be compromised, how many of those garrison fires sheltered soldiers whose loyalty had been purchased by interests he could not yet fully identify. Everything you cannot hold will eventually be taken from you. The old lesson. The foundational truth that had driven every decision since his father's death. But the lesson had always been about external threats, enemies at the gates, rivals in the court, conspirators in the shadows. It had never accounted for the possibility that the hand helping you hold everything together was the same hand quietly loosening the joints. "We have days," Kaelor said, "not weeks. The Crown will learn that Aldrich has been exposed, and when they do, they will accelerate whatever operational timeline they are working from. If they have been building toward a political intervention in Blackmere's governance, using financial irregularities, intelligence reports, and Southern dissident pressure as leverage, they will move to execute before I can consolidate a defensive position. You need allies. I need information. Allies come after." He turned from the window. "Your father. Lord Castellan Virel controls the Ashen March Pass. If the Crown moves against Blackmere, they will need the pass to maintain supply and communication lines with the northern territories. Your father can either grant that access or deny it." "My father will deny it if I ask him to." "I am not asking you to ask him. I am asking you to present him with the evidence we have. Aldrich's correspondence, Lord Marin's network, the Crown's intelligence operation, and let him make his own calculation. A man who has been betrayed by his own steward and manipulated by the Crown will reach the correct conclusion without persuasion." Seraphine studied him. The way she always studied him, not the surface assessment of expression and body language, but the deeper reading of intention, motivation, the architecture beneath the visible structure. "You could have ordered me, instructed me to contact my father as an extension of Blackmere's authority. Instead, you are asking me to act as his daughter. Because a duke's order can be countermanded by a higher authority, a daughter's evidence cannot. That is not the only reason." No, it was not. The other reason lived in the space between them that had been narrowing for 23 days. The space where control ended and something else began. Something that Kaelor had no framework for, no protocol to manage, no historical precedent within his own experience to reference. He had spent his entire adult life eliminating variables he could not control. Seraphine was a variable he could not control, and instead of eliminating her, he was standing in a locked room asking for her help, while the institutional structure of his duchy crumbled around them. The man he had been 25 days ago would have called this weakness. The man standing here now, with the wreckage of Aldrich's betrayal still settling in his chest like debris from a controlled demolition, understood something that the previous version of himself had never been forced to confront. Strength that depends on control is not strength. It is rigidity, and rigidity does not survive the kind of impact that hits the foundation rather than the walls. "Send word to your father tonight," Kaelor said. "Use your own channels, not Blackmere's communication network. I can no longer verify its integrity." Seraphine nodded and moved toward the door. As she reached for the lock, she paused, turned, looked at him with an expression that contained something he had never seen directed at him by another human being. Not fear, not calculation, not the guarded assessment of someone measuring a threat. Something closer to the way a person looks at someone they have decided to stand beside regardless of what comes next. "For what it is worth," she said, "I am sorry about Aldrich." The words landed in the one place where Kaelor had no armor, not because they were unexpected, but because they were genuine, and genuine sympathy directed at a man who had just lost the person he trusted most in the world was the kind of precision strike that no amount of emotional fortification could absorb without structural consequences. "Do not be sorry for me," he said. "Be ready for what comes next." She left. Kaelor locked the door behind her and stood alone in his study, the room where he had ruled Blackmere for 15 years through maps and numbers and the absolute certainty that information, properly controlled, could make any man invincible. The maps were still on the walls, The numbers were still in the ledgers, but the certainty was gone, replaced by something that felt less like power and more like the raw material from which power might eventually be rebuilt, if he survived the next 72 hours. He sat at his desk and began writing orders, not the measured, strategically calibrated directives that had characterized his governance for a decade and a half. These were battlefield orders, the stripped-down, immediate, survival-focused commands of a commander who has just discovered that his defensive perimeter has been breached and must establish a new line before the enemy exploits the gap. Recall all garrison units to defensive positions within 12 hours. Seal the castle's secondary entrances. Replace the guard rotation with soldiers from the eastern border units who had no contact with Aldrich's administrative network. Secure the armory, the treasury, and the emergency supply caches. Establish independent communication channels to Commander Rathmore that bypass every system Aldrich had ever touched. He wrote for 2 hours. His hand did not shake. His handwriting did not waver. Whatever had broken inside him when he opened that drawer had been immediately repurposed. The debris of shattered trust converted into fuel for the engine of survival that had kept him alive since the age of 19. Pain was energy, betrayal was information, and the hollow space where 22 years of loyalty used to live was now available for something more reliable than trust had ever been. The courier from Seraphine's channel reached House Virel before dawn. Lord Castellan Virel's response arrived before noon the following day, faster than any political communication should have traveled through the Ashen March Pass network, which meant that Seraphine's father had received the intelligence about Lord Marin's betrayal and the Crown's operation and had reacted with the urgency of a man who finally understood how close he had come to destruction. The response was 3 words: "The pass holds." 3 words that changed the strategic geometry of everything, but they arrived 6 hours too late. Because at dawn on the 26th day, while Kaelor was reviewing Rathmore's defensive positioning in the castle's war room, a rider came through the main gates at a gallop that left the horse's flanks foaming and the rider barely conscious in the saddle. The message he carried was from Blackmere's outermost garrison, 70 miles south, and its contents turned the next several hours into the most violent chapter in the Ashbourne dynasty's history. 3 noble houses from the southern provinces had mobilized, not a diplomatic protest, not a political maneuver, a military column. 600 armed men moving north through the lowland passes, flying banners of 3 families that had been named in Lord Marin's financial network as recipients of diverted Ashen March Pass revenues. And riding at the head of the column, bearing authorization from the Crown's Privy Council, was Chancellor Aldous Thane himself. The Crown had not merely escalated. The Crown had converted its intelligence operation into a military intervention, using the southern dissident houses as armed proxies and the Chancellor's authority as legal cover. The stated justification would be the financial irregularities Aldrich had referenced, administrative discrepancies reframed as evidence of ducal corruption, providing the Crown with pretext to place Blackmere under direct royal governance. Kaelor read the garrison report twice. Then he folded it, placed it on the war table, and looked at Commander Rathmore with the expression of a man who has been expecting a storm and has just heard the first crack of thunder. "How many can we field?" Rathmore's jaw worked for a moment before the numbers came. 340 combat ready within the castle perimeter. Another 200 from the eastern garrisons, if we recall them immediately, but that strips the border. Strip it. The border threat is theoretical. The column moving north is actual. 540 against 600, and their 600 includes heavy cavalry from House Drachen's personal guard. I am aware of House Drachen's capabilities. Kaelor leaned over the war table, Suchult, the same table his great-grandfather had used to plan the defense of Blackmere during the last northern uprising, a century before Kaelor was born. The surface was scarred with the marks of 100 strategic sessions, 100 desperate calculations made by men who understood that the fortress they occupied was designed not for comfort, but for the specific purpose of making attacking armies bleed for every inch of ground. The lowland passes funnel into 2 approach corridors before reaching the castle valley. Both corridors are bordered by high ground. How fast is the column moving? The rider estimated 2 days' march. They will reach the castle approaches by dawn, day after tomorrow. 2 days. 48 hours to prepare a defensive position against a numerically superior force backed by the Crown's legal authority and funded by 18 months of stolen trade revenues. 48 hours to convert a castle whose internal security had just been gutted by its own steward's betrayal into a fortress capable of withstanding a siege. Kaler straightened from the war table and felt something shift inside his chest. Not the sickening collapse of Aldrich's betrayal or the dangerous warmth of Seraphine's proximity, but something harder. Something that lived in the same place where fear and fury intersected, but was neither. The particular state of a man who has been stripped of every advantage except the one advantage that cannot be taken. The willingness to fight with nothing left to lose except the ground beneath his feet and the people standing on it. A man with everything to protect and nothing left to hide behind becomes the most dangerous creature in any kingdom. Not because he has abandoned reason, but because he has finally achieved the brutal clarity that comes only when every comfortable illusion has been burned away, and the only thing remaining is the raw, undecorated truth about what he is willing to do and what he is willing to become in order to survive. "Seal the gates," Kaler said. "Full war footing. Every soldier, every servant, every person inside these walls who can hold a weapon or carry supplies gets a roll. No exceptions." "And the Chancellor's legal authority?" "The Chancellor's legal authority ends at the point where armed men march on a sovereign duchy without formal declaration of cause. That is not governance, Rathmore. That is invasion. And Blackmere has a very specific tradition for handling invasions." He left the war room and descended into the ancient corridors beneath the castle, the labyrinth that his ancestors had built 3 generations ago as a final defensive measure against exactly this kind of siege. Passages carved into the cliff face, reinforced with iron supports and stone buttresses, connecting the castle's interior to a network of chambers, choke points, and concealed exits that no attacking force could navigate without knowledge of the layout, knowledge that Aldrich had possessed. Kaler stopped in the corridor. The realization hit him with the force of a crossbow bolt to the sternum. Aldrich knew the labyrinth. Aldrich had maintained the structural records for the underground passages as part of his administrative duties. If any of that information had reached the Crown through the cipher correspondence, then Blackmere's final defensive advantage, the ancient corridors that had saved the Ashbourne dynasty in every previous siege, was compromised. He pressed his back against the stone wall. The rock was cold through his shirt, cold enough to feel in his bones. And in that cold, in the darkness of a passage built by dead men for the protection of men not yet born, Kaler Ashbourne made the decision that would define everything that followed. He would not defend Blackmere the way his ancestors had defended it. He would not retreat into the labyrinth and wait for the enemy to exhaust itself against fortified positions. That strategy depended on the enemy not knowing the layout. If Aldrich's intelligence had reached the Crown, the labyrinth was not a refuge. It was a trap. Instead, he would do what no Duke of Blackmere had ever done in the history of the fortress. He would open the inner gates deliberately, let the enemy enter the labyrinth thinking they had breached the castle's last defense, and then use the passages not as a shield, but as a weapon, a killing ground where Blackmere's smaller force, operating with intimate knowledge of every corridor and choke point, could neutralize a numerically superior army by making their numbers a liability in confined spaces where heavy cavalry could not maneuver and formation discipline became meaningless. It was insane. It was the strategy of a man who had nothing left except the stone beneath his feet and the willingness to turn that stone into a graveyard. It violated every principle of defensive warfare that had kept Blackmere standing for a century. And it was the only play on the board that the Crown would never anticipate, because no rational commander would voluntarily surrender the defensive advantage of a fortified position. Kaler was no longer operating on rationality. He was operating on the crystallized remains of everything that had been destroyed in the last 48 hours. Trust, certainty, the belief that control alone could preserve what mattered, compressed under impossible pressure into something that was harder than strategy and sharper than calculation. The diamond-edged clarity of a man who understands that survival is not a plan. Survival is what happens when a man stops trying to control the outcome and starts fighting with the full, terrifying weight of who he actually is. He climbed back to the surface and found Seraphine in the corridor outside the war room. She was already wearing a heavy cloak, her hair pulled back, her face carrying the expression of someone who had heard the garrison rider's news and had immediately begun her own calculations. "My father's response," she said. "The pass holds. He will deny the Crown's column any retreat route through the Ashen March corridor. They marched north. They will not march south again through viral territory. That cuts their supply line. That was the intention. He looked at her, stood in the corridor of his castle, with armed men running past them in both directions, with the sound of iron gates being sealed and weapons being distributed echoing through stone halls that had stood for a century. And he looked at this woman who had arrived 26 days ago in a carriage with no escort and had systematically dismantled every defensive structure he had ever built around himself. Not through force, not through deception, but through the relentless, patient application of competence and clarity until the walls he maintained against the world became indistinguishable from the walls he maintained against himself. I need you inside the castle during the assault, not in the chambers. In the war room. Coordinating communication between garrison positions. I know. This is not a request, it is an operational assignment. I know that too. She held his gaze. And when this is over, we are going to have a conversation about the difference between giving orders and asking for help. But that conversation can wait until there is not an army marching toward our gates. Our gates. The possessive pronoun landed in his chest like an anchor finding the bottom of deep water. Not his gates, not Blackmir's gates. Our gates. Two words that accomplished what 26 days of strategic proximity had been building toward, the acknowledgement that this fortress, this fight, this stand against an empire's attempt to consume them was not his burden alone. He had never shared a burden. He had carried them, controlled them, compressed them into the dense private architecture of a man who believed that asking for help was the first step toward the kind of vulnerability that got rulers killed. But rulers who refused to share the weight eventually broke under it. And the difference between breaking and bending, the difference between a structure that collapses and a structure that absorbs the impact and remains standing, was not rigidity. It was the presence of another load-bearing element positioned at exactly the right point to distribute the force across a wider foundation. "Stay close to me," Kaler said. The words came out before his strategic mind could intercept and rephrase them into something that sounded more like a command and less like what they actually were. Seraphine did not point out the distinction. She simply nodded and fell into step beside him as they moved toward the war room, where Commander Rathmore was already assembling the defense that would determine whether Blackmir survived or became a cautionary tale about the cost of trusting the wrong people. 41 hours later, the southern column appeared on the horizon. Kaler stood on the highest battlement of Blackmir Castle and watched 600 soldiers arrange themselves across the valley floor in formation. Banners of 3 noble houses snapped in the wind beside the crown's standard. At the center of the formation, visible even at distance, was a command pavilion bearing the Chancellor's seal. The sky above was the color of iron. Thunder rolled across the mountains to the east, and the first drops of rain began to fall on stone that had been standing since before anyone alive could remember. Blackmir Castle rose above the valley like something that had grown from the cliff face rather than been built upon it, dark, massive, and resolute in a way that made the army below look temporary. Kaler gripped the battlement edge. The stone was wet under his palms. Rain mixed with the sweat that had been building across his body for hours as the physical preparation for combat, the flooding of adrenaline, the tightening of every muscle group, the narrowing of vision to essential inputs only, transformed him from a man who governed through systems into a man who survived through action. Below him, inside the castle, 540 soldiers waited in positions that made no conventional military sense. The outer gates were reinforced, the inner gates were unlocked. The labyrinth beneath the castle had been prepared with barricades, choke points, and concealed positions that would turn every corridor into a killing channel once the enemy entered. The trap was set. The bait was the castle itself, and the trigger was Kaler Ashbourne, standing on this battlement in full view of 600 enemies, letting them see exactly one man between them and the fortress they had marched 2 days to take. A horn sounded from the valley. The signal for parley. Chancellor Thane was requesting a conversation before committing to assault, the formality of a man who wanted legal record that peaceful resolution had been offered and rejected before blood was spilled. Kaler did not send a representative. He descended from the battlement, walked through his own castle in full armor for the first time in 3 years, and rode through the outer gates alone. He met Aldous Thane in the center of the valley, midway between the castle walls and the assembled army. The Chancellor was a narrow man in his 50s, seated on a horse that was too large for his frame, wearing the ceremonial robes of the Crown's highest administrative office. He looked exactly like what he was, a bureaucrat commanding soldiers, a man whose power came from documents rather than capability. Duke Ashbourne. Thane's voice carried the practiced authority of someone who had spent 30 years speaking on behalf of kings. I come bearing a writ of royal inquiry. The Crown has received evidence of financial irregularities and administrative corruption within the Duchy of Blackmere. You are hereby ordered to submit to a formal audit of your ducal accounts, surrender operational authority to a Crown-appointed administrator, and present yourself before the Royal Council for examination. Kaelor sat on his horse in the rain and let the Chancellor's words dissipate into the wind. 600 soldiers at his back, 540 waiting inside the castle behind him. And between those two forces, 2 men on horseback having a conversation that both of them knew was theater. Chancellor? Kaelor's voice cut through the rain with the flat precision of a blade drawn across a whetstone. You marched 600 armed men to my gates, and you are calling this an inquiry. The military escort is a precautionary measure. The military escort is an invasion force funded by 18 months of capital diverted from the Ashen March Pass through a financial network operated by Lord Marin of House Viral, with the coordination of a compromised intelligence asset inside my own household. Kaelor let the silence after that sentence do its work. Thane's face did not change, but the Chancellor's hands tightened on his reins, a tiny, involuntary contraction that confirmed everything. You are not here to investigate corruption, Chancellor. You are here to install it. Duke Ashbourne, I strongly advise, turn your column around. March south. Present yourself before the Royal Council and explain how Crown funds were used to finance a military operation against a sovereign duchy without formal declaration of cause. Kaelor pulled his horse one step closer. Close enough that the Chancellor could see the rain running down armor that had not been worn in 3 years and the expression of a man who had decided exactly how this day would end. Or stay, and discover what happens when you bring 600 men to a castle that was built to bury armies. Chancellor Thane held Kaelor's gaze for 4 seconds. Then he pulled his horse around and rode back to his command pavilion without another word. The horn sounded 20 minutes later. Not parley. Advance. Kaelor rode back through the outer gates as the first wave of Southern cavalry began their charge across the valley floor. The gates sealed behind him with a sound like a vault door closing. The deep, resonant boom of iron and oak designed to withstand siege engines and battering rams. He dismounted in the courtyard, where Rathmore was already issuing final positioning orders, and he looked up at the sky one last time. Rain and thunder, the weather of endings. Open the inner gates on my signal, he told Rathmore. Not before. Let them breach the outer wall. Let them fill the courtyard. Let them believe they have already won. He drew his sword, a weapon that had belonged to his father and his father's father, and every Ashbourne duke who had understood that the difference between a dynasty and a memory was the willingness to bleed for the ground you stood on. Then we show them exactly what Blackmere was built for. The outer wall held for 47 minutes. Kaelor's archers dropped the first cavalry charge at the gate, and the second, and the third. But 600 men applying sustained pressure against a position defended by a fraction of their number was arithmetic, not strategy, and arithmetic eventually won. The gates cracked. The courtyard flooded with Southern soldiers whose battle cries echoed off wet stone walls as they poured through the breach, expecting to find a defending force arrayed in conventional formation. They found an empty courtyard. Kaelor watched from the inner gallery as confusion rippled through the enemy ranks. 200 men standing in an open space that should have been defended, looking at each other and at the silent walls around them with the dawning recognition that something was fundamentally wrong with what they were seeing. He gave the signal. The inner gates opened, not in surrender, in invitation. The ancient corridors of Blackmere's underground labyrinth yawned before the invaders like a throat, torchlit and seemingly undefended, leading deep into the heart of the castle. The Southern commanders saw the open passages and made the calculation that every attacking commander makes when presented with an apparent vulnerability. They committed forces into the breach, sending soldiers into the corridors in pursuit of the Duke they believed was retreating into his final refuge. They did not know the labyrinth. They did not know that every junction had been barricaded to create channels that funneled movement in only one direction. They did not know that 300 of Blackmir's soldiers were positioned in concealed alcoves, behind murder holes, and at choke points where 10 men could hold against 100 because the stone corridors were too narrow for more than 3 soldiers to stand abreast. They learned. The fighting in the labyrinth was not warfare, it was anatomy. Kaelor had converted his castle into a living organism that digested invaders, drawing them deeper into passages that tightened and twisted, separating units from their command structure, cutting communication lines, and engaging in close-quarters combat where heavy cavalry armor became a coffin rather than protection. Kaelor fought at the forward choke point, not behind his soldiers, beside them, in the narrow corridor where the ancient stone walls pressed close enough that he could feel the breath of the men fighting next to him on his neck. His sword work was not elegant. Elegance required space. In these corridors, combat was industrial. Short, brutal exchanges measured in inches rather than yards, where the winner was determined not by skill, but by the willingness to absorb damage and keep advancing. Blood ran along the corridor floor. His blood. Their blood. The distinction ceased to matter after the first 10 minutes because pain, in the compressed environment of hand-to-hand combat in a space designed to amplify violence, became background noise, a constant signal that the body registered and the mind overrode because stopping to process pain was a luxury available only to men who were not currently fighting for the survival of everything they had ever built. His shoulder took a blade edge that sliced through the gap between pauldron and breastplate. The cut was deep enough to expose muscle, but not deep enough to reach the joint. He registered the injury the way a machine registers a maintenance alert, noted, filed, compensated for through immediate adjustment of his fighting stance to reduce strain on the damaged side. His left hand took over primary blade work, while his right arm hung at a reduced angle, still functional, but operating at 60% capacity. A man who has nothing left to lose does not fight harder. That was the myth. The truth was more specific and more terrifying. A man who has nothing left to lose fights with perfect efficiency. Every movement stripped of hesitation, every decision made without the drag of self-preservation, every strike delivered with the full commitment of a body that has accepted damage as the cost of continued operation and has decided that the cost is acceptable. Kaelor Ashbourne fought through the labyrinth of his ancestors' castle with the sword of his father's dynasty in his hand and the sound of an empire's attempt to consume him echoing off walls that had been standing longer than any throne, and he did not stop, did not slow, did not retreat. Somewhere above, in the war room, Seraphine was coordinating the defensive communication that kept Blackmir's scattered positions operating as a unified force. Her voice carried through the speaking tubes that connected the labyrinth to the surface, calm, precise, relaying position updates and enemy movement patterns with the steady rhythm of someone who understood that in the chaos of battle, the voice that does not panic becomes the axis around which everything else organizes. He could hear her. Through stone and iron and the screaming of men fighting in corridors too narrow for mercy. He could hear her voice, and for the first time in his life, the sound of another human being did not represent a variable to be controlled or a threat to be managed. It represented the one fixed point in a world that was currently tearing itself apart around him. The battle turned at the third choke point. Kaelor's forces had held the first 2 positions for over an hour, grinding the southern advance to a crawl that cost the attackers 3 men for every foot of corridor gained. But at the third choke point, a junction where 3 passages converged before a reinforced iron door, the Southern commanders committed their remaining reserves in a concentrated push that overwhelmed the defenders through sheer mass. The iron door buckled. Kaelor's men fell back. The enemy surged forward into the junction, and for 30 seconds, the defense of Blackmir Castle balanced on the edge of collapse. Then Kaelor stepped into the junction, alone, not because there was no one else to stand there, because the junction was wide enough for only one man to block effectively, and the man who blocked it needed to be someone whose presence communicated a message that transcended tactical positioning. The message was simple, absolute. And it landed in the consciousness of every Southern soldier who rounded that corner and found the Duke of Blackmir standing in their path with blood running down his armor and his father's sword held in a grip that had not loosened since the fighting began. You will not pass this point. You will not take this castle. You will not reach the woman behind these walls. And every one of you who tries will learn that the most dangerous man in any kingdom is not the one with the largest army or the strongest fortress. The most dangerous man is the one who has finally discovered what he would rather die than lose. He held the junction, alone, for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Long enough for Rathmore's reserve unit to arrive through a concealed passage and reinforce the position. Long enough for the southern advance to stall, fracture, and begin the disorganized retreat that signaled the turning point of the battle. Long enough for a sword strike to find the gap beneath his breastplate and open a wound across his ribs that dropped him to one knee in a corridor flooded with the blood of men who had come to take his home and had found instead the particular hell that awaits anyone who underestimates a man defending the only thing he has left. Rathmore's soldiers pulled him back from the junction. The commander himself pressed a cloth against the wound while shouting orders for the pursuit of retreating enemy forces. Kaelor sat against the corridor wall with his back against stone that his great-grandfather had laid and felt the warmth of his own blood soaking through his shirt beneath the armor. The sounds of fighting were receding, moving away from the castle's core, moving outward toward the surface as Blackmere's defenders drove the broken southern force back through the labyrinth toward the courtyard and the shattered outer gates. "Your Grace," Rathmore's face was close, urgent. "The Chancellor's command group. They did not enter the labyrinth. They are still in the courtyard with a personal guard of approximately 40 men. If we seal the outer gates behind the retreating force—" "Do it!" Kaelor's voice was thin. Blood loss was beginning to affect his peripheral processing, narrowing his cognitive bandwidth to essential functions. "Seal the gates. Trap the Chancellor inside. His personal guard against our full garrison. You need a surgeon." "I need the Chancellor in chains. The surgeon can wait." He stood. The wound screamed. His vision narrowed to a tunnel with Rathmore's face at the center and darkness at the edges. He put his hand against the wall and forced his body upright through the specific mechanism that had kept him functioning since the age of 19. The conversion of pain into fuel, damage into information, and the absolute refusal to stop moving while the ground beneath him still required defending. He climbed toward the surface, toward the courtyard, toward the final confrontation with the man who had sent an army to take his home and was about to discover that the cost of that decision was higher than any chancellor had ever paid. The courtyard was chaos, rain and blood and the wreckage of battle. Southern soldiers streaming toward the outer gates in retreat, while Blackmere's garrison moved to seal the exits. And at the center of it all, surrounded by 40 personal guards in a defensive formation that was already contracting as the situation deteriorated, Chancellor Aldous Thane sat on his horse with the expression of a man watching his own political career transform into a criminal proceeding in real time. Kaelor emerged from the labyrinth entrance into the rain. His armor was painted in blood, his own and others, and his sword hung from a hand that had not released its grip in over 2 hours. He walked toward the Chancellor's position across a courtyard littered with the fallen, and every step sent a pulse of agony through the wound beneath his breastplate that he acknowledged and overrode with the mechanical discipline of a system that had been designed to continue operating under conditions that would have shut down anything less ruthlessly constructed. He stopped 30 feet from the Chancellor's guard formation. Rain ran down his face, blood ran down his side. And from the castle's upper gallery, visible to everyone in the courtyard, Seraphine stood watching, not hiding, not cowering, not performing the role of the helpless noblewoman waiting to be rescued. Standing, bearing witness, the way a woman stands when she has chosen her ground and refuses to be moved from it by any force, any threat, or any outcome. Kaelor looked up at her. 1 second. The length of a single heartbeat in a chest that was pumping blood through a body that should have been on a surgeon's table 20 minutes ago. Then he turned to the Chancellor and raised his sword. "Aldous Thane, by the sovereign authority of the Duchy of Blackmere, you are charged with armed invasion of a northern territory without formal declaration, conspiracy to overthrow ducal governance through military force, and the financing of insurrection through misappropriated crown funds." His voice carried across the courtyard with a clarity that the rain could not diminish and the thunder could not drown. "Surrender your guard. Surrender your authority. or I will take both from you the way Blackmere has taken everything from every army that has ever been foolish enough to march on these walls." The Chancellor's guard formation tightened. 40 men, professional soldiers, well-armed, well-trained, and staring at a wounded duke standing alone in a blood-soaked courtyard with the full weight of a dynasty's fury burning in his eyes. Thane opened his mouth to respond, and from behind him, from the sealed outer gates that should have contained the retreating southern force, came a sound that froze every person in the courtyard. The gates were opening. From the outside. Not Blackmere's soldiers, someone else. A force that neither Kylor nor the Chancellor had accounted for in their calculations. The iron gates groaned inward, and through the widening gap, torchlight-illuminated banners that Kylor recognized instantly. House Virel, House Dawnmere, House Ashcroft. 3 northern noble houses that had never publicly aligned with Blackmere. 3 houses that controlled territories adjacent to the duchy's borders. 3 houses whose loyalty Kylor had never sought because his philosophy of governance had never included the concept of asking for help. And riding at the head of 300 fresh soldiers, armored and battle-ready, was a rider bearing a standard that Kylor had seen only once before, in Seraphine's personal effects, unpacked on the desk of her East Wing chambers, the Virel family crest. Kylor turned to look at Seraphine on the gallery above. She met his gaze across the rain and the blood and the wreckage of a battle that had pushed him to the absolute limit of what one man could hold. She had not merely sent a message to her father. She had activated an alliance. The courtyard held its breath. 300 fresh soldiers behind him. 40 Chancellor's guards before him. And Kylor Ashbourne standing between them with the rain washing blood from his armor and a question forming behind his eyes that had nothing to do with military strategy and everything to do with the woman who had just changed the mathematics of his survival without asking for his permission. He tightened his grip on his sword and waited for the Chancellor to calculate the odds. Chancellor Aldous Thane calculated the odds in 11 seconds. 40 personal guards, a wounded duke with 500 soldiers inside the castle walls, 300 fresh northern troops pouring through the gates behind Virel banners, and the rain, the relentless freezing rain that turned the courtyard stones into a surface where cavalry could not charge and infantry could not hold formation without sliding on a film of water and blood. Thane was not a military man. He was a bureaucrat who had wagered his career on the assumption that Blackmere's duke would either submit to a show of force or fight alone and lose. Both assumptions had just died in the courtyard alongside the soldiers who had carried them north. "Order your guard to lay down arms," Kylor said. His voice carried across the 30 feet between them with a steadiness that should have been impossible for a man losing blood through a wound beneath his breastplate. But Kylor had learned something in the labyrinth that no training had ever taught him, that the body follows the voice, not the other way around. If the voice holds, the body finds a way to hold beneath it. "This is not a negotiation, Chancellor. This is the last decision you will make as a free man. Choose well." Thane looked behind him. The viral forces had sealed the outer gates and were advancing across the courtyard in disciplined formation, their movements coordinated with the kind of precision that only came from a commander who had planned this intervention well in advance. The Chancellor's personal guard, professional soldiers to a man, read the geometry of the situation faster than their employer. One by one, weapons lowered. Not dropped. Lowered. The distinction of men who understood that they had been placed in an unwinnable position by a superior who had miscalculated, and who intended to survive the consequences of his error with their professional dignity intact. Thane dismounted. The movement was stiff, graceless. The physical signature of a man whose body was processing the collapse of authority faster than his mind could construct a narrative to contain it. He stood in the rain in his ceremonial robes, silk already soaked through, the weight of the fabric dragging his shoulders downward, and for the first time since riding into this valley with the confidence of a man backed by 600 soldiers and the crown's seal, Chancellor Aldous Thane looked exactly like what he was. Small. Rathmore's soldiers took him into custody. The personal guard was disarmed and escorted to the holding cells beneath the East Tower, the same cells that Kylor had once described to Torrin Brask as never having been called comfortable by anyone who survived them. The southern soldiers who had retreated from the labyrinth were corralled outside the castle walls by the combined Blackmere and Viral forces, stripped of weapons, and held under guard in the valley where their own camp had been established the night before. The battle for Blackmere was over. The cost of that battle was written in the courtyard, in the bodies that lay where they had fallen, in the blood that the rain was slowly washing between the stones toward the drainage channels at the courtyard's edges, in the damage to the outer gates that would take weeks to repair, and in the wound beneath Kaelor Ashbourne's breastplate, which had been bleeding for 43 minutes and was now producing the particular lightheadedness that preceded either unconsciousness or death, depending on how quickly a surgeon could reach the tissue damage. Kaelor did not go to the surgeon, not yet. He stood in the courtyard and watched the Viral forces complete the securing of the castle perimeter, and he waited for the rider who had led 300 soldiers through Blackmere's gates at the exact moment when the battle's outcome hung in the balance. The rider dismounted near the inner gate, removed a helmet that had been forged in the Viral family's armory. And beneath the helmet was a face that Kaelor recognized from the intelligence dossier Aldrich had compiled months ago, Lord Castellan Viral's younger brother. Margrave Dorian Viral, a military commander who had spent 20 years defending the Ashen March Pass and who had apparently ridden north with 300 men the moment his brother received Seraphine's message. Dorian Viral crossed the courtyard with the stride of a soldier who had just completed a forced march and was operating on the particular fuel that burns when family is at stake. He stopped in front of Kaelor and studied the Duke's condition with the clinical assessment of a man who had seen enough battlefield wounds to categorize them by severity at a glance. "You need a surgeon. I need to know who sent you." "My brother, who received a message from his daughter, who apparently decided that the Duke of Blackmere was worth saving." Dorian's mouth did something that was almost a smile but carried too much exhaustion to fully commit. For the record, she was more specific than that. Her message contained a full tactical assessment of the Crown's military column, a strategic analysis of Blackmere's defensive capabilities, and a recommendation that House Viral commit 300 soldiers to the northern approach corridor with timing calibrated to the estimated duration of the castle's defensive capacity. "Your wife planned this intervention down to the hour, Your Grace." Kaelor absorbed that information while his peripheral vision continued its slow contraction toward tunnel focus. She had not merely sent for help. She had designed the rescue, calculated the variables, mapped the timeline, coordinated the deployment. The same systematic competence that had identified supply chain inefficiencies in a conversation with a cook applied at the scale of a military operation that had just saved his duchy. "Get the surgeon," Kaelor said. And then, because the body's tolerance for willpower has a finite limit that even the most ruthlessly constructed system eventually reaches, his knees unlocked and Dorian Viral caught the Duke of Blackmere before he hit the courtyard stones. He woke in his own chambers. The first thing he registered was pain, a deep, sustained burning across his left side where the surgeon had closed the wound with stitches that pulled against the muscle tissue with every breath. The second thing he registered was light, late afternoon, judging by the angle of sun through the window. He had been unconscious for hours. The third thing he registered was the sound of someone breathing in the chair beside his bed. Seraphine. She was sitting with her legs drawn beneath her, a stack of documents on her lap, a pen in her hand. Working. Even now, with the castle still processing the aftermath of a battle that had killed men in the corridors beneath their feet, she was working. Reviewing reports, compiling information, maintaining the operational continuity of a duchy whose administrative infrastructure had been gutted by its own steward's betrayal. Kaelor watched her for a long moment before she noticed he was awake. In that moment, silent, unobserved, stripped of every performance and every protocol, he saw her clearly in a way that 27 days of strategic assessment had never achieved. Not as a variable to be controlled, not as a threat to be contained, not as a political asset or a crown operative or a strategist deploying competence as a weapon. As a woman who had chosen to sit beside a wounded man and continue the work of holding his world together while he could not. The recognition landed in his chest with a weight that had nothing to do with injury and everything to do with the slow, terrifying process of a man who has spent his entire adult life constructing walls, discovering that the most important things in his world are all on the other side of them. "How long?" he said. His voice came out rough, damaged, the vocal equivalent of a road that has been driven over by heavy machinery. She looked up, set the documents aside. The transition from working professional to present companion took less than a second, and Kaylor noticed that the shift did not involve putting on a different face. She did not rearrange her features into an expression of concern or relief or tenderness. She simply stopped dividing her attention and gave all of it to him. 7 hours. The surgeon says the wound is clean, no infection, but you lost enough blood that he recommended 2 days of rest. She paused. I told him you would give him 6 hours, and he should consider that a victory. You know me that well already. I know that you stood alone at a choke point for 4 minutes against an advancing enemy force 12 hours after discovering that the man you trusted most in the world had been betraying you for over a year. I know that kind of man does not stay in bed because a surgeon recommends it. Kaylor pushed himself upright. The wound protested violently. He overrode the protest through the same mechanism he had been using since the fighting began, acknowledging pain as data, processing data as input, converting input into adjustment rather than reaction. But the mechanism was slower now, less automatic, as though the system that had governed his responses for 15 years was running at reduced capacity, and the reduction was not caused by blood loss or exhaustion, but by something more fundamental. The walls were down. Not the castle walls, it's those it held, the inner walls, the architecture of control and containment that he had built around his own capacity for connection, his own need for trust, his own terrifying vulnerability to the specific damage that only comes from letting another person matter. Aldrich's betrayal had demolished those walls from the inside. The battle had prevented him from rebuilding them. And now, sitting in his bed with stitches in his side and Seraphine's steady gaze across the 3 feet of space between them, Kaylor understood that the walls were not coming back. Not because he lacked the material to reconstruct them, but because the man who had built them no longer existed. That man had died somewhere in the labyrinth between the second and third choke point, and what had walked out of those corridors was someone who had not yet learned the shape of his own new architecture. The Chancellor, Kaylor said. Status. Confined. His formal correspondence has been seized and Rathmore's intelligence officers are cataloging the contents. The preliminary review suggests that the writ of royal inquiry was drafted before any actual investigation into Blackmere's finances. The Crown manufactured the legal pretext after the military operation was already authorized. She handed him a folded document from the stack on her lap. Your leverage is absolute. The Crown authorized an armed invasion of a sovereign duchy based on fabricated evidence. Every northern house that was uncertain about your position will align with Blackmere the moment this information becomes public. And Aldrich. The name landed in the room like something heavy being set down on a hard surface. Seraphine's expression did not change, but her hands went still in her lap, the only tell she could not fully control, the physical indicator that the subject they were approaching carried weight that even her extraordinary composure could not entirely absorb. Confined, under guard. He has not spoken since your confrontation. Kaylor looked at the window. The late afternoon light was turning gold as it filtered through glass that still bore the faint print of his palm from the night he had stood there processing Seraphine's arrival. 27 days ago. A lifetime ago. A version of himself ago that had looked at this same landscape and felt absolute certainty about who he was and how the world worked and what he needed to do to keep everything he had built intact. That certainty was the most expensive thing Aldrich's betrayal had cost him. More expensive than the military intelligence. More expensive than the compromised communication networks. More expensive than the 22 years of service that now had to be re-examined through the lens of divided loyalty. The certainty that he could build a system strong enough to make trust unnecessary. That was what he had lost. And losing it had broken something that he did not yet have a word for. Because the vocabulary of a man who governs through control does not include terms for the experience of discovering that control was always an illusion, maintained by the cooperation of people he refused to acknowledge he depended on. I need to speak with him, Kaylor said. Now? Now. He stood. The wound made its objection known through a cascade of pain signals that ran from his left rib cage to his hip. He dressed slowly. No armor, no chain of office, no coat, a shirt and trousers and boots. The the clothing of a man rather than a duke. The distinction mattered because what he was about to do could not be done from behind the architecture of rank. Seraphine watched him dress without offering assistance. She understood, perhaps better than anyone had ever understood, that Kaelor Ashbourne's relationship with physical suffering was not about stoicism or performance. It was about sovereignty. The body was the last territory he governed with absolute authority, and maintaining that authority through pain was not vanity. It was the mechanism by which he confirmed to himself that the person inside the armor was still capable of standing. She walked beside him through the castle corridors, not behind him, not ahead, beside. The geometry of equals moving through a space that had been designed for hierarchy, servants and soldiers. They passed, registered the positioning, and filed it away, the way institutional memory files everything, silently, persistently, into the collective understanding that shapes how a household operates and who it recognizes as authority. They descended to the holding cells together, and at the cell door Seraphine stopped. "Do you want me with you for this?" The question was not about logistics. It was about the specific kind of vulnerability that Kaelor was about to walk into. The confrontation with a man who had known him since he was 19, who had helped him bury his father, who had stood beside him through every crisis and every triumph of his adult life. The conversation that was about to happen would expose parts of Kaelor that no political ally, no military commander, and no crown official had ever been permitted to see. Seraphine was asking whether he wanted a witness. "Wait here," he said. Then, because the old patterns of command were still his default, and the new patterns of honesty had not yet become automatic, he paused and corrected himself. "I need to do this alone, but I need you to be here when I come out." She nodded. And Kaelor opened the cell door and stepped inside. Aldrich Voss sat on the narrow bed against the far wall. The cell was clean. Blackmir's holding facilities were maintained to the same standard as every other operational space in the castle, because Kaelor had always believed that the condition of your lowest priority infrastructure reflected the integrity of your entire system. The steward's hands were folded in his lap. His posture was upright. His face carried the particular emptiness of a man who has already processed every possible outcome of his situation and has arrived at the conclusion that none of them involved the restoration of what he has lost. Kaelor stood inside the door. The cell was small enough that standing was the only option that maintained any meaningful distance between them. 6 feet of stone floor. 22 years compressed into a space the size of a servant's closet. "I am not here for more explanations," Kaelor said. "I have your correspondence. My people are decoding it. I will know the full scope of your communication with the Crown within days. What I need from you is not information. It is something I have never asked you for in 22 years of service, because the man I was 22 years ago believed that asking for it was a form of weakness." Aldrich looked up. His eyes were the eyes of a tired man, not defeated, tired. The exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a secret for 14 months and is discovering that the relief of exposure is more devastating than the weight of concealment. "I need to understand," Kaelor said, "whether any of it was real." The question filled the cell the way water fills a vessel, completely, pressing against every surface, finding every crack. Aldrich's composure, maintained through the confrontation and the confinement and the hours of isolation, fractured along a line that ran from his jaw to his eyes. Not dramatically, not with the visible collapse that lesser men displayed under pressure. A structural fracture, the kind that changes the load-bearing properties of a material without altering its visible shape. All of it was real. Aldrich's voice was raw, stripped of the precise diction that had characterized 22 years of meticulous service. Every hour I spent building the systems that run this duchy. Every recommendation I made that kept Blackmir functional. Every crisis I helped you navigate. The Crown's leverage did not change what I was. It added a second obligation to a man who already had one. And the weight of carrying both crushed me so slowly that by the time I understood I was being destroyed, I no longer had the capacity to stop it. Kaelor stood very still. The cell air was cold. His wound throbbed beneath the shirt with each heartbeat, and he could feel his pulse in the stitches, a constant, rhythmic reminder that the body he was operating was damaged, and that the damage would heal only if he allowed the time and conditions for healing rather than overriding the body's signals with willpower. He was beginning to understand that the same principle applied to damage that was not physical. "You should have told me." The words came out quieter than he intended, quieter than the Duke of Blackmere ever spoke. The volume of a man talking to someone he had trusted more than anyone alive and discovering, in the aftermath of that trust destruction, that the grief of betrayal was not anger. It was loss. The specific, irreplaceable loss of a relationship that had been built over 2 decades of shared work and shared crisis, and the particular bond that forms between two people who construct something together from nothing and watch it become powerful enough to threaten empires. Whatever the crown held over you, whatever the leverage, you should have brought it to me, and we would have found a way to neutralize it together. You would have gone to war with the crown 14 months ago, before Blackmere was ready, before the northern houses had any reason to align with you. You would have reacted with the same absolute force you apply to every threat, and the crown would have used your aggression as justification for exactly the kind of military intervention they just attempted. Aldrich met his gaze. "I made a wrong choice, Your Grace, but I made it trying to buy time for a duchy that was not yet strong enough to survive the confrontation I knew was coming." The silence that followed was not the silence of strategy or calculation. It was the silence of two men sitting with a truth that was too complex for the categories of loyal and disloyal, right and wrong, forgivable and unforgivable. Aldrich had betrayed him. That fact was structural and permanent. Aldrich had betrayed him while simultaneously trying to protect the duchy from a premature conflict that would have destroyed it. That fact was also structural and permanent. Both truths occupied the same space. Both were load-bearing, and the question was not which one to believe, but whether Kaelor Ashbourne had the capacity to hold both simultaneously without one collapsing under the weight of the other. "Your service to Blackmere is terminated," Kaelor said. Each word cost him something that he could feel leaving his body the way warmth leaves a room when a window opens. "You will not be executed. You will not be imprisoned permanently. You will be escorted to the southern border under guard and released beyond Blackmere's jurisdiction. What you do after that is your affair." Aldrich nodded. Once. The motion of a man accepting a sentence that was harsher than death in one dimension and more merciful than he had any right to expect in another. Exile. The severing of the only institutional identity he had carried for 22 years. The loss of purpose without the loss of life. Which, for a man whose entire existence had been organized around service to a single household, was a punishment that would continue delivering its consequences for as long as he breathed. "You deserved better from me," Aldrich said. "Whatever the reasons, you deserved better." Kaelor looked at him for a long time. In that look was everything he would never say out loud. The acknowledgement of loss, the weight of grief that lived beneath the anger, the terrible understanding that forgiving someone who has betrayed you is not an act of weakness, but an act of self-preservation, because carrying unforgiven betrayal is a weight that compounds over time until it becomes heavier than the original damage and begins destroying structures it was never intended to touch. He did not say any of it. But Aldrich, who had spent 22 years reading his master's silences the way navigators read weather patterns, understood everything that the silence contained. "Goodbye, Aldrich." "Goodbye, Your Grace." Kaelor left the cell, closed the door behind him, stood in the corridor and breathed. Seraphine was there, where she had said she would be, where she had chosen to be. Not because he had ordered her to stay, but because she understood that the man who walked out of that cell would need something waiting for him that was not a system, not a protocol, not a mechanism of control. Something human, something real. Something that existed outside the architecture of power and governance and operated on the older, simpler, infinitely more terrifying foundation of two people who had chosen to stand beside each other without conditions. He looked at her. She looked at him. The corridor was empty. The torch on the wall cast amber light across stone that had been standing for 100 years and would stand for 100 more, regardless of who walked its halls or what decisions they made within its walls. "Is it done?" she asked. "It is done." She did not ask what he had decided. She did not ask how he felt. She did not offer comfort or analysis, or the kind of reflexive reassurance that people deploy when they do not know what else to say in the presence of someone else's pain. She stood beside him in the corridor and let the silence hold both of them, the way stone holds the weight of everything built on top of it, steadily, without complaint, for as long as the load requires. They walked back through the castle together, through corridors that still carried the echoes of battle, past doorways where servants were already beginning the work of restoration, cleaning, repairing, restoring the physical infrastructure of a fortress that had survived its most severe test. The household staff moved around Kalor and Seraphine with the instinctive deference of people who had watched their duke defend the castle with his own blood and now understood that the authority he carried was not merely institutional. It was earned, purchased at a price that no title or inheritance could approximate. In the Great Hall, Commander Rathmore was waiting with a status report. The southern forces were secured. Casualties on both sides had been tallied. The labyrinth was being cleared. Damage assessments were underway for the outer gates, the courtyard structures, and 3 sections of the inner wall that had been compromised during the fighting. Kalor took the report, reviewed it, and issued orders with the methodical precision that the situation demanded. Infrastructure repair priorities, prisoner processing protocols, communication dispatches to the northern houses that had sent forces to Blackmere's defense. Each order carried the weight of a duke reasserting governance over a duchy that had been pushed to its breaking point and had not broken. But the tone was different. Rathmore noticed it. The household staff noticed it. Everyone who had served under Kalor Ashbourne for more than a year noticed that something had shifted in the way their duke occupied his authority. Not the content of his commands, which remained as precise and as demanding as ever, but the quality of the presence behind them. The iron was still there. The discipline was still there. The absolute refusal to accept anything less than excellence from himself and from every person operating within his system was still there. But the rigidity was gone. The brittle, load-bearing rigidity that had made Kalor Ashbourne the most feared duke in the Northern Territories, the quality that made men flinch when he entered a room and made advisors measure every word before speaking, had been replaced by something that was harder to name but unmistakable to observe: flexibility. The specific, earned, battle-tested flexibility of a material that has been subjected to stress beyond its design tolerance and has discovered, in the process of surviving that stress, that it is capable of bearing more weight than rigidity ever allowed. Not because the material has become weaker, but because it has learned to distribute force across a wider foundation rather than concentrating it on a single load-bearing point. Kalor had been that single point for 15 years, the man upon whom everything rested, the center around which every system revolved, the rigid, unbreakable pillar that held Blackmere upright through the same mechanism that ensured no one else could share the weight. Because sharing weight required trust, and trust required the acceptance of vulnerability, and vulnerability was the one thing that Kalor Ashbourne had sworn to eliminate from his existence the day he buried his father in the frozen ground and promised himself that nothing would ever be taken from him again. The promise had been kept, at the cost of everything that made keeping things worth the effort. Standing in the Great Hall, issuing orders for the reconstruction of a duchy that had just survived a siege, Kalor understood for the first time that the promise itself had been the vulnerability. The commitment to absolute control was not strength. It was a single point of failure. A load-bearing element so concentrated that any crack would propagate through the entire structure. And the crack had come, not from an enemy's sword or a chancellor's writ or an army at his gates, from a steward's divided loyalty and a woman's unwavering clarity and the slow, relentless pressure of evidence that control was not the foundation of power. Connection was. The days that followed the battle were the slowest Kalor had experienced since the year after his father's death. Not slow because nothing happened. A staggering amount happened. Chancellor Thane was formally charged, and his arrest documented for presentation to the Royal Council. The Crown, faced with the combined political leverage of Blackmere, House Virel, and 3 allied northern houses, disavowed the military operation and began the elaborate institutional process of pretending that an armed invasion of a sovereign duchy had been a misunderstanding rather than a policy. The southern noble houses that had funded Marin's network were stripped of their territorial claims within Blackmere's jurisdiction, a process that Kalor executed with the same methodical precision he had applied to Idrin Caswell's dispossession, but with one critical difference. He offered terms of rehabilitation to those whose involvement had been financial rather than military. Surrender the misappropriated capital, accept restructured trade agreements, submit to Blackmir's audit authority for a period of 5 years. In exchange, retain your titles and your primary holdings. Mercy. Not the word Kaelor would have used. He would have called it strategic leniency, the calculated decision to preserve a functional political relationship rather than creating a permanent enemy through total destruction. But the distinction between mercy and strategic leniency was thinner than he had ever previously acknowledged, and Seraphine's presence at the negotiating table during those proceedings, silent, observing, her mere existence a reminder that the Duke of Blackmere was no longer operating as a solitary system, made the distinction thinner still. Lord Marin was arrested at the Ashen March Pass by House Virel's own soldiers. The steward who had quietly built a shadow financial empire beneath the legitimate operations of one of the kingdom's most powerful trade corridors was brought to Blackmere in chains and presented before the Duke, whose domain he had infiltrated through the patient, methodical corruption of trusted intermediaries. Kaelor looked at Marin's face and saw a reflection of Aldrich's, a different man, a different motivation, but the same fundamental architecture. The trusted servant who becomes the invisible threat precisely because trust makes them invisible. He processed Marin through Blackmir's judicial system with the detached efficiency of a man who has already done his grieving for this particular category of betrayal and does not intend to do it twice. Seraphine's father arrived at Blackmere 3 weeks after the battle. Lord Castellan Virel was 63 years old and carried himself with the careful dignity of a man who has recently been forced to accept that his judgment of character, the quality he had valued most in himself, had failed him catastrophically. He greeted his daughter with an embrace that lasted longer than political protocol permitted, and he met Kaelor's eyes with the particular expression of a father assessing the man who had risked his life to protect the daughter he had sent into a dangerous situation. "She was not supposed to fight a war," Virel said to Kaelor, standing in the great hall where Seraphine had first challenged Commander Rathmore over garrison deployments. "She was supposed to build an alliance." "She did both," Kaelor said. "The war was an unplanned addition." Virel studied the Duke for a long moment. "My daughter tells me you held a choke point alone against a superior force. Your brother tells me your daughter planned the military intervention that made holding the choke point matter." Something passed between the two men. Not friendship. The relationship between a duke and the father of his wife does not operate on the currency of friendship. Something more structural. The mutual recognition of men who understand that the woman connecting them is stronger than either of them fully comprehended before circumstances force the demonstration. "Take care of her," Virel said. "Not because she needs protection, because she deserves a partner who understands the difference." Kaelor accepted the statement without deflection. A month ago, he would have heard it as an implication that he was incapable of understanding the distinction between protecting someone and partnering with them. Now he heard it for what it was. The concern of a father who had watched his daughter walk into the most dangerous fortress in the kingdom and wanted assurance that the man inside it recognized what she had brought through those gates. "I understand the difference," Kaelor said. "She taught me." On the evening of the 40th day since Seraphine's arrival, Kaelor stood at the window of his private chambers and looked out over the valley below. The outer gates had been rebuilt. The courtyard stones had been scrubbed clean of blood. The garrison fires along the perimeter burned with the steady consistency of a defensive system that had been tested and had held. Blackmere was stronger than it had been 40 days ago. The alliance with House Virel and the northern houses had created a political coalition that no crown intervention could threaten without provoking a unified northern response. The trade revenues from the Ashen March Pass, freed from Lord Marin's parasitic infrastructure, flowed into Blackmere's treasury at levels that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. The duchy's military reputation, already formidable, had been transformed by the battle into something that transcended mere fear. Blackmere was not merely dangerous. Blackmere was the duchy that had swallowed an army in its own corridors and spit out the pieces. But strength was not the word that occupied Kaelor's mind as he stood at the window where his palm print had once marked the frost. The word that occupied his mind was one he had spent 15 years systematically excluding from his vocabulary because it represented everything his governing philosophy had been designed to replace. Trust. He heard Seraphine enter the chambers behind him. She moved with the same economy of motion that had first caught his attention in the courtyard 40 days ago. No wasted gestures, no theatrical composure, no energy spent on anything that did not serve the moment's purpose. She crossed the room and stood beside him at the window. Not in front of him, not behind. Beside. The geometry they had established in the corridor outside Aldrich's cell maintained through every subsequent interaction with the unconscious consistency of two people who had found their natural positioning relative to each other and saw no reason to alter it. Rathmore's final damage report, she said, handing him a folded document. Structural repairs will be complete within the month. He is recommending a redesign of the outer gate mechanism to incorporate a secondary reinforcement system. Kaylor took the report, read it, set it on the windowsill. The mechanical rhythm of administrative governance, the daily processing of information, decisions, and directives that kept a duchy operational, continued without interruption. It would always continue. The machinery of Blackmere did not stop because its architect had been transformed by the experience of nearly losing everything he had built. The machinery adapted, the way all functional systems adapt when their operating parameters shift, not through dramatic reconfiguration, but through the quiet, incremental adjustment of 10,000 small interactions that collectively reshape the character of the entire structure. "I owe you something," Kaylor said. Seraphine turned to look at him. The evening light caught her features in the same shifting planes of gold and shadow that he had first observed across the dinner table 4 weeks ago. And in that light, standing at the window of the chambers where he had made every significant decision of his adult life, she looked like someone who had always been part of this room's architecture, as though the space had been waiting for her presence to achieve its completed form. "You do not owe me anything. I owe you the truth, which is something I have never voluntarily provided to another person, because the man I was before you arrived believed that truth was a vulnerability, and vulnerability was a threat." He paused. Not for dramatic effect, for accuracy. Because the words he was about to say had never been assembled in this order before, and he wanted them to land with the precision they deserved. "You did not change me, Seraphine. What you did was more dangerous than that. You made it impossible for me to continue being the version of myself that I had constructed as a defense against exactly the kind of person you turned out to be." She did not respond immediately. She let his words exist in the space between them, the way she had let every significant moment between them exist, without rushing to fill the silence, without interpreting or analyzing or redirecting, letting the weight of what was said settle naturally into the foundation of what they were becoming. "The version of yourself that you constructed," she said quietly, "was remarkable. He built a duchy from ruins. He defended it against every threat for 15 years. He created a system so effective that it required the crown's full intervention to challenge." She held his gaze. But he was exhausted, and he was alone. And those two things were going to destroy him eventually, because a system with a single point of failure does not survive the failure. It just takes longer to collapse. Kaylor looked at her. At this woman who had walked into his castle carrying her father's burden and her own capability and the dangerous, unshakable clarity of a person who sees people as they are rather than as they present themselves to be. Who had sat at his dinner table and told him that threatened men make speeches about control. Who had planned a military rescue down to the hour while he was bleeding in a corridor beneath his own castle. Who stood beside him now, not behind, not in front, beside, with the steady, permanent presence of someone who had chosen her ground and intended to hold it for as long as the ground existed. "You are not my possession," he said. "You were never my possession." That word, that concept, was the framework of a man who believed that holding something tightly enough was the same as keeping it. It is not. Holding tightly is what you do when you are afraid of losing. Keeping is what happens when you build something worth staying for. The evening light shifted. The valley below Blackmere Castle settled into the long golden hour before dusk, when the landscape took on the quality of something painted rather than real. Too perfectly lit, too precisely shadowed, too deliberately beautiful to be anything other than the world performing its daily reminder that destruction and creation are not opposite forces, but sequential stages of the same process. Seraphine took his hand, not the gesture of a woman claiming possession or offering comfort, the gesture of a person establishing contact with the foundation they intend to build on. her fingers interlaced with his the way load-bearing structures interlace, each element supporting the other, the combined capacity greater than either component alone. Kaelor felt the contact through his entire body, not as warmth or electricity or any of the metaphors that poets use to describe the physical experience of being touched by someone who mattered, as architecture, as the sensation of a new load-bearing wall being placed into position, distributing weight across a wider foundation, converting a structure designed for one into a structure designed for two. They stood at the window together, Duke and Duchess of Blackmere. The most feared household in the Northern Territories, governed by a man who had learned that the most dangerous thing in any kingdom was not power or conspiracy or the treachery of trusted servants. The most dangerous thing was the willingness to remain unchanged when the world demanded transformation. And the most powerful thing, more powerful than any army, any fortress, any dynasty built on stone and steel, and the iron will of men who refused to bend, was the decision to let another person stand close enough to see the cracks and trust them not to exploit the view. Below them, Blackmere Castle settled into evening. Torches were lit along the walls. Soldiers changed shifts at the gates. The kitchen fires began their nightly work of feeding a household that had survived its greatest test and emerged not merely intact but fundamentally restructured, stronger at the joints, more flexible under pressure, and anchored by a foundation that no longer depended on a single pillar to bear the full weight of everything built on top of it. The legend of Duke Kaelor Ashbourne would spread across every kingdom in the years that followed. Some remembered him as ruthless. Some remembered him as merciless. Some remembered only the Battle of Blackmere, the Duke who opened his own gates and turned his castle into a weapon and held a choke point alone while an empire tried to take what he had built. But those who knew the full story remembered something different. They remembered that the most powerful duke in the Northern Territories became truly powerful not on the day he won his battle, but on the day he stopped fighting alone. That the fortress which had never fallen did not survive because its walls were strongest, but because the man inside them finally understood that walls are not what make a fortress hold. People are. And in the chamber at the top of Blackmere Castle, where the Duke and Duchess stood together at a window overlooking a domain that belonged to both of them equally, the evening light faded into the deep blue of northern twilight. The stars appeared above the mountains one by one, each point of light a small, persistent refusal to be consumed by the dark. The wind carried no sound except the distant rhythm of a castle settling into the quiet machinery of peace. And Kaelor Ashbourne, the Duke who had once believed that everything you cannot hold will eventually be taken from you, stood beside the woman who had taught him the rest of that lesson. Everything you refuse to share will eventually be carried alone, and everything carried alone will eventually become too heavy for even the strongest man to bear. The only things that last are the things you are willing to hold with open hands, trusting that what stays does so, not because you grip it, but because it chose to remain. Blackmere held. Not because its Duke commanded it. Because its people, all of them, from the soldiers at the gates to the woman at his side, chose to hold it together. And that was the only kind of power that history remembers.